that class. So remember in Unit 4, we were talking about the 4 different methods to define the property, the legal description. So we had meets and bounds and government rectangular survey system. And the 4th one we said was reference to a previously recorded deed. And we said we don't use that much in North Carolina anymore because it's just not accurate if it's there at all. The example we gave in class was that you may have reference, the deed may say, see previously recorded deed. So you go find that deed and then it says, see previously recorded deed, right? So now you're doing like a little chase down the rabbit hole trying to find the previously recorded deed. Well, yesterday, my part of my role with my sales firm is that I do compliance. So I check the files, make sure the required documents are there, make sure we have all the signatures and the dates, just make sure that we have everything we need. So I was looking at a file yesterday in compliance, and I came across a legal description on a deed, and it kind of made me laugh a little bit because I thought, well, gee, what another good reason that we can't rely on these things. This is a screenshot of the legal description that is found in the public records. Let's pretend for a second that we're surveyors and we know how to interpret this. Can you guys make that out? Do you see how fuzzy that is? Do you see how long that is? Even if I make it big, it's not real clear. And it starts, our point of beginning is at N iron stake. What iron stake? Any iron stake. Is that iron stake still there, right? We got lots of questions about that N iron stake. This thing just blew my mind when I looked at this. Again, even if we were, let's just pretend for a second we're in surveyor school. Wouldn't this be really hard to interpret, really hard to try and figure out where that iron stake is to begin, and then walk through all those dimensions? Every once in a while, one of the monuments might be like the tree. Whoa. What tree? Trees fall down. So I just found this really interesting. Again, this was found straight on the public records. I don't know. It was dated 94. So I'm not sure what the story was before it wound up in the public records. But I just saw this and thought, what another good example, what another good reason why I can't rely on this. Because even if I could read it, I don't know what all this means. That's the job of the surveyor. So I say all that to say, encourage your buyers to have a survey done. It'll help them properly identify those property lines, unless a plat map is available, of course. It'll help them identify those property lines. They might be able to understand and interpret their own legal description, etc. So that was that. So back into pre-licensing world. And specifically, we're still in Unit 6. We kind of we talked about some public land use controls. Specifically, I'm going to go back so you guys listen to me. This is where we left off. We talked about some public land use controls. Specifically, we talked about zoning. And the trick to understanding zoning is the terms. So we went over the terminology. And then we kind of broke into some government regulations. So not necessarily local. Government regulations could be statewide, they could be nationwide. The government regulations, we talked about building codes and permits and your certificate of occupancy, also known as the CO. And then we were talking about those on-site septic systems. Remind me, how many human heartbeats per bedroom allowed? I'm seeing 2. Yep, I would agree. So 2 human heartbeats per bedroom. Again, what we're saying is that's telling us the capacity of the tank. What will this tank support? So in other words, if the permit says it's a 3-bedroom, if the permit says 3 bedrooms, then it means the tank will support 6 people. And remember, it's all water leaving the home. There's algorithms out there that determine how much water each individual uses, that kind of thing. The big takeaway from our on-site septic permit discussion is how we can advertise, how we can list the properties. You may have a seller look at you and say, well, we use this as a 5-bedroom house. Great, you got 4 bedrooms and maybe the basement's been converted to a 5th bedroom, right? I cannot advertise it as a 5-bedroom house unless the on-site septic permit says 5. Is everybody with me? We can only advertise the number of bedrooms allowed per the permit. Listing agents, you got a lot of work to do before you list. And we're going to talk, we'll get more and more into that conversation. We got a lot of research. We're already starting to learn some things that we need to look up, such as the septic permit. So we make sure that we're properly advertising the number of bedrooms. This is where we left on Tuesday, was talking about straight piping. And I know this whole screen just seems icky, but generally, I think most commonly where we see straight piping might just be from like a washing machine. For example, some on-site septic systems may not support a washing machine, so the answer might be just connect the hose to the back of the house and run that water right out to the creek. Yeah, that's not allowed. We're getting more and more into this idea of material facts as well. So we're going to start seeing that more next week when we get into Unit 7 is when we're going to do our deep dive in material facts. Just introducing you to these things right now. Any questions so far in Unit 6 before we look at the rest? Good morning. So another government regulation is flood hazards, properties, and flood zones. Whether or not a property is in a flood hazard is determined by FEMA. FEMA is the Federal Emergency Management Agency. Don't worry about that now. We'll see FEMA again later. But now, flood hazards is a government regulation. And if FEMA determines that the property, the structure, is in a flood hazard, then the lender may require flood insurance. And I'm going to tell you something right now. If you know, you know. If you don't know, let me tell you. Flood insurance is not cheap. Flood insurance is not cheap at all. So let's imagine for a second that you're working with a buyer and they're looking at properties at the max at the top of what they're approved for, what the lender says they can afford. That when the lender gives the pre-approval, they're considering the payment, interest, taxes, all those good things we're going to talk about in our lender units, 14 and 15. But if flood insurance is required and they're about maxed out anyway, flood insurance might tip them over. And if they go over their allowable amount, we're not going to get loan approval. So listing agents, this is something that we need to disclose if the property is in a flood hazard. Buyer's agents, we may want to look just to be sure so we can advise our buyers, we can prepare our buyers. I'm not the flood hazard expert, I'm not the insurance expert, and I'm not the lender, but I can look at a map and see if this is in a flood hazard or not, and just give my buyer that heads up. The land could be restricted on where you build, what you can do on it. I mean, we don't want to build a house in a soggy swampland and have it sink into the ground over time, right? So it just may be restricted on what we can do on that land. We got a whole unit dedicated to insurance, homeowners insurance, flood insurance, all that is Unit 13. So that's when we'll see flood hazard again, specifically talking about flood insurance. Another government regulation are our highways. We talked the other day about private versus public streets, but other things that we can access that we need to look up before we list a property. If you go to NCDOT's website, North Carolina Department of Transportation, you can find planned construction projects. You can find those that have been approved. Sometimes they even list those are under consideration. So a few minutes ago, I just said listing agents, there's a whole lot of work that goes into researching a listing. And again, one step at a time. Once you guys affiliate with your firms, your firm will give you a checklist. They'll help you out to know the things to look up to help you research to list this property. Listing agents, most of your work is done up front before the public ever sees the property for sale. And searching things like highways, plan construction, flood hazards, zoning, that's all part of that checklist that we're looking up. Plan constructions is another one of those material facts. Again, right now, just understanding our duty to material facts is to discover and disclose. We have this duty to find out. And when we find out, no matter how we find out, we have this further duty to disclose. We cannot hide our head in the sand. If the Real Estate Commission can find it on NCDOT's website, they will surmise that you could have found it too. Does that make sense? So we have this duty to do this research. Again, building on that more and more into that. Another government regulations are our wetlands. Any of you folks down east probably deal more with wetlands than what we do here in the Triad, or even you guys up in the mountains. So with wetlands, your groundwater is at or near the surface. You don't need much rain to start seeing puddling. It's going to flood on the often. And these things are heavily regulated. One, we want to protect our wetlands. We want to protect the wildlife that lives in the wetlands. And two, this takes us back to, I mean, it'd be hard to build a house on this thing. You have it sinking down fast. So there's restrictions and regulations on the wetlands. Questions on, very brief, lots of green stars, but questions on our government regulations. The last little piece, one of the last little pieces of Unit 6 is to talk about private land use controls. So we talked the other day about public land use controls, which is our zoning. And the difference between public and private, generally speaking, is how are they enforced? Who enforces them? So when we talked about our public land use controls, we said it's enforced by the local government. If you think your neighbor is violating zoning, call the cops. Let them look into it. Let them address it. Public land use controls are enforced by our local government. If we switch gears and talk about our private land use controls, we're talking about our homeowners associations, also known as HOAs. Some properties are in an HOA, some are not. Some buyers want to buy into an HOA, some don't. Everybody's got their preference. HOAs provide us with covenants or rules, if you will. This is one of these fun things in real estate that we have multiple names that mean the exact same thing. So restrictive covenants, protective covenants, and CCRs are all referring to, let's say, the rules of the HOA. Every single HOA is different. You may get your hands on covenants for an HOA here, and then the covenant's going to look totally different in an HOA across the street, a different subdivision, a different HOA. Us helping our buyers and sellers get their, specifically buyers, getting their hands on on covenants, so they can understand the rules moving into this HOA. These covenants and HOAs are created by the developers when they develop the property, when they develop the area. And covenants are pertinent. What's it mean to be a pertinent? They run with the land. So the first homeowner in the subdivision has to follow the covenants. The second one, the third one, the 56th one. Now, covenants can change. May it be that the homeowners vote to change. May it be we take it to the court and they change. I'm telling you right now, changing covenants is no easy feat. Please don't let me make that sound like an easy process. If you have buyers that have certain things that they want, for example, maybe you have a buyer look at you and say, I want to build a fence. Can I build a fence? Well, if it's in an HOA, we need to get our hands on those covenants to make sure that they will allow a fence. Remember what we know about a fence and a shed. The only thing you know when you see a fence is that somebody put one there. Just because you see a fence in a subdivision in an HOA, does that mean the HOA allows it? No, you don't know. The HOA could be, if it's not allowed and you see a fence, they could be fining that homeowner X amount every day that the fence is up. We could be in the throes of the legal battle to have that fence removed because it's a violation of a covenant. So when your buyer says, oh, good, I was wondering if I can have a fence, and I see that guy, y'all know the Joneses, right? I see the Joneses have a fence, that means I can have one too. Your answer is, I don't know. Let's get our hands on those covenants and look. Does everybody hear me? The only thing you know when you see a fence is that somebody put one there. The only thing you know when you see a shed is that somebody put one there. So when I flip this screen, how do people feel about HOAs? Well, when I flip this screen, I'm pretty sure I could have put us in two different categories. Those of you that went, ew, look at that house. And then the rest of us went, ooh, look at that house. If the idea of living next door to the Pepto-Bismol house doesn't appeal to you, then you may want to consider looking into an HOA. A lot of times, HOAs may have restrictions on colors, or if nothing else, exclusions on colors you can't use. They may have restrictions on your front yard decor, the color of your front door. Some of them have restrictions on how tall the grass in your front yard can be. Right? Some of them are more strict than others. Can you park the RV in the driveway? I don't know. Let's get our hands on the covenants. Can you park in the street? I don't know. Let's get our hands on those covenants. Some people like the idea of having those restrictions, those standards, to preserve the value. Other people, it doesn't matter. Some of you may not want to live next door to the neighbor that has cars on cinder blocks. There's a really good chance that won't be allowed in an HOA. If you're not in an HOA, you don't have any power or control over that whatsoever. Everybody with me? So they're all different. And again, ultimately, it comes down to buyer preference. So if your buyer looks at you and says, I don't want to live in an HOA, it's so simple, you guys. Don't show them properties in an HOA. And when one does come on the market and they say, oh man, can I see that? Then we need to say, that's fine, but understand, it's in an HOA. And what's one of the first things you told me? You don't want an HOA. Let's see. So why are some subdivisions under an HOA and others aren't? It's how the developer sets it up. Some developers will create it under an HOA, and others may just build a house and not create these covenants. So typically with covenants, some matters addressed. Provisions, again, that require property maintenance. So again, how tall can the grass in your front yard be? Is there, here are 3 choices that you can paint your front door, 3 color choices. And they may also have restrictions on parking, fencing, etc. Can you have a fence? Can you have a shed? If it's in an HOA, the covenants will address that for us. So these covenants are imposed by the developer when they create the subdivision. And once the developer leaves, the covenants remain because they're pertinent. So the developer builds the last house, they get all their equipment out of that subdivision, and they go on to the next, right? And they leave behind a set of covenants that future homeowners need to abide by. If public land use controls are enforced by local government, then private land use controls are enforced by owners associations or the individual. Again, it just depends on how they're set up, how they're created. So it might be that the HOA is managed by a property management company. It might be that the HOA is managed by the people that live there. And we all take turns being president, vice president, secretary, treasurer, like, right? Like we all contribute. As mentioned, they're pertinent, which means they run with the land. They go from the one owner to the next, to the next, to the next. Again, never look at a buyer and say, oh, you can get that changed. Just take it to a judge and they'll tell you you're allowed a fence. It's not that easy, you guys. It's not that easy. And I would never encourage anybody to buy a house under that presumption. The other thing about covenants is they can't be for anything that's illegal. Now, let me give the developer some credit. It might be that when it was created, it was fine. And then rules and laws change and now it's illegal. And if that happens, then they can't be enforced. For example, you may have had subdivisions created back in the 50s or 60s. And one of the provisions in the covenants may have said that certain members of a protected class can't live here. Today, that's illegal and it can't be enforced. That's illegal today thanks to federal fair housing. I got a whole unit dedicated to fair housing. So we're going to talk about fair housing, who those protected classes are, and what it means to be a protected class. But today, you know, back in the day when it was created, it wasn't illegal. Today, though, it is, so it can't be enforced. Covenants are public records, which means we can generally find, you may find a copy that looks as pretty as the deed we just saw, the legal description in the deed. They're not a clear copy always. But with your buyers, specifically with your buyers, my job is to help them get their hands on the covenants. Hear me, I can't interpret the covenants. Remember, I'm a fact finder. I provide you the information for you to make an informed decision. So as your agent, as a buyer's agent, I'm going to help you get those hands on your covenants. Maybe I find them in the public records. Maybe we reach out to the listing agent or the seller. Maybe we go straight to the HOA directly and ask them, right? We got several different ways to get it. My job is to help you get your hands on those covenants. When my buyer looks at me and says, what does this mean? That just got me out of my lane. We either need to get them to their attorney to interpret it or get them to the HOA. So we are fact finders. I'm not going to interpret surveys. I'm not going to interpret covenants. Not my job. Questions on our private land use control, specifically our covenants, when we're in an HOA? Are the covenants the same as bylaws? That's a great question. And I'm actually going to address that next. Let's put real estate aside for a second. Let's pretend that real estate doesn't exist. Anytime you have a conflict of laws or rules, anytime you have a conflict of laws or rules, the stricter of the two will prevail. So what I mean by that is which law is more strict, and that's the one that'll win. That's the one that'll take over of the two. See, we very well and often do come across conflict, back to real estate, between zoning and the covenant. And the rule says, or it says, if we have a conflict, zoning says one thing, the covenants say something else. So which one do we follow? And the answer is the stricter of the two. Which one is more restrictive? Which one is more strict? For example, there's this new craze out there. Everybody wants chickens. Buyers want chickens. I think this comes on the tail end of the egg crisis we had. Was it just last year? Y'all remember that? Now everybody wants chickens. So your buyers are going to say, I want chickens. Great. If they're looking, first off, we need to make sure zoning allows for chickens. Do we allow for farm animals? If so, if it does, is there a restriction? They might say 2 chickens and a goat, for example, right? So does zoning allow it? And then the second piece is it in an HOA? And if so, we need to make sure that the covenants allow it as well. If zoning and or covenants do not allow chickens, then we need to tell our buyer that. Again, I can't tell them not to buy there, but what I can tell them is if you do buy here, you're not allowed to have chickens. So if chickens is something that's really, really important to you, then we need to keep looking for properties that will allow chickens. Another good example, you might have zoning that allows for commercial and residential, this multi-use, multi-purpose zoning. So maybe it allows for both, which would allow you to live there, for example, and have your garage converted to the hair salon. So, okay, so far so good. We know zoning will allow it. But then covenant steps in and says, no independent business allowed. So zoning allows it. They say commercial, but the covenants say no business. Can your buyer convert their garage into a hair salon in that HOA? No, because the stricter of the two, covenants are a lot more strict and they can't. And that's all we're saying. And again, we're going to see there's a handful of times in this class that we see conflicting laws and rules. And this is always the truth. The more restrictive of the two will prevail. Questions? Let's bring this unit home to us. Like I said the other day, this is really the first unit that we start talking about what our responsibility is. So you got on page 126, it says responsibilities of the real estate broker. I think you need to read that. I think that's important. And I'm looking at some red stars here. So yes, there's test questions on 126, 127, and we're starting to prepare you for the real world. So our responsibilities as a broker when it comes to these land use controls. I have a duty to review land use controls, public or private, before I list the property or before I write up an offer for a buyer. Remember, one of my super simple philosophies, if it's important to my buyer, then it's important to me. And if my buyer looks at me and says, I have to have chickens, then I have a duty to make sure that that end use will be allowed. If my buyer wants to convert their garage into a hair salon, if my buyer wants to run a daycare out of their living room, out of their home, once I know my buyer's end use, I have a duty to help them gather the information to make sure it's allowed. And again, I'm not interpreting. Interpreting is not our job because I'm a fact finder. So when you do get your hands on those covenants, for example, or you do get your hands on the zoning, and your buyer or seller says, what does this mean? Or can I do this? Or I don't understand, or I don't feel like reading it. Can't you just tell me in a summary what it means? Our answer has got to be, no, I can't interpret. So if they want that interpretation, then we need to either get to them to an attorney, or again, if we're in covenants or an HOA, get them to the HOA, let them interpret it for them. These next couple slides, I'm going to go off book. So you're not going to find what I'm saying in these next few slides, except on the screens. We're recording and we have our PowerPoints in the online learning system. But a few more points that the syllabus brings to our attention. We need to advise consumers if the property is subject to an owner's association, or is it in an HOA? If it is in an HOA, there's going to be dues and special assessments. So we can help them get that information. Understanding dues and assessments do go up over time. All I can tell them is what are the dues right now. Most HOA dues they can be monthly, they can be annually, maybe they're quarterly. I'm just helping them gather that information. The lender will take HOA dues into consideration as well. Make sure that those HOA dues don't put them over their pre-approved amount. I have a duty to advise consumers if the covenants could affect how they want to enjoy the property. So again, once the buyer shares something of specific importance to me, then I need to make sure that they can use it in the way that they intend to buy it. If they don't tell me, I don't know, right? I don't know about you guys, but my mind reading skills are weak at best. So if you don't tell me, I don't know. This is why buyers agents are encouraged to sit down with their buyers and ask them questions. I go old school. I hand them a piece of paper, draw a line down the middle of it. One side is your wants, the other side is your needs. What is it specifically you're looking for? And that can help me determine if we need to look into the zoning or the covenants to make sure that they can use the property in the way that they intend. Typically, we want to try to get our hands on those covenants, provide those to our buyers before they make an offer. Sometimes that happens, sometimes it doesn't. The last couple of years, we've been in a crazy seller's market. It's softening some, but the last few years, I don't know if anybody tried to buy a home 2 years ago. There were properties, y'all, I'm not kidding. Properties were on the market for like 10 hours, and then they were going under contract. So it was hard to do all that information. But even with a swift moving market, that doesn't negate my duties and responsibilities. So still trying to get that bit of information so they can make that informed decision. The buyers also have a period of time once we go under contract to do their inspections and investigations to learn about the property. We're going to talk about that when we get into contracts in Unit 10. So more on that. The other thing I want to make sure that we start identifying, I've said it a few times. I try not to say it until this slide, but I know I've said it a few times. Real estate agents, we constantly need to be on the lookout for red flags. And when we come across a red flag, that's triggering us to investigate, to ask questions, to look something up, to help the buyer or seller understand what it is that we're seeing. And we need to constantly be on the lookout to recognize these red flags and be able to identify things that make us say, whoa, we got to look something up. We need to go to the zoning, or we need to get the covenants, or we need to do this, we need to do that. So I know to help you find the information you need to know if you want to buy, to know if you want to sell. Again, you guys, I'm not the one buying this house. I'm not the one selling this house. I'm helping buyers and sellers go through that process. So that checklist I've mentioned that your firm will probably provide, that lists what you need to do, the steps you need to take, and what you need to look up before you list a property, that's helping us identify red flags, things that we may have to address, things that we may have to take care of. Your buyer consultation, when you hand them a piece of paper and say wants on one side and needs on the other, that's helping us identify these red flags. That's helping us identify what it is we're looking for, what it is we're doing to assist these buyers and sellers. So you're going to hear me say more and more about your little red flag. And what I'm telling you right now, when your little red flag goes up, that's your trigger to discover. That's your trigger to do some research, to help your buyers and sellers get the answers they're looking for so they can make that informed decision. Questions? The very last piece of Unit 6, just briefly mentioning some government-owned land. It's estimated that the government owns about 30% of the continental United States. It's a good chunk of land they own, don't they? They're going to use that land for various purposes. You're seeing here. Just to help maintain their government functions. That area is going to be preserved. I doubt you're going to get a call to list a municipality building for sale in downtown Raleigh, right? The government will handle that. They're going to regulate and control their land. So just a kind of a brief FYI, there's only about 70% you and I get to deal with. The rest of it is used up for those government functions. And that gets us through Unit 6. Questions on Unit 6? Don't forget too, in the online learning system, there's that Q&A brochure on the creation of subdivisions and streets. We talked about streets being public or private. We talked about the difference in dedicated versus accepted. So that Q&A brochure, it's in the online learning system in the Unit 6 material. Again, just another tool to help you guys better understand, get a better handle of this material. Good on Unit 6? Yep, sure can. All right. Now we're going to jump way ahead in the book. I don't go in order of the book. I go in order of the syllabus. And we're going to jump way ahead. Well, the old syllabus of this. And we're going to get into Unit 20. Unit 20 is our environmental issues. Who got a chance to look at Unit 20? Look ahead at Unit 20? A few of you? Unit 20 is the unit that'll terrify you to breathe the air that we breathe. This is a scary, scary unit. There's a lot of crazy things out there in our atmosphere, y'all. So our responsibility with these environmental issues, again, is to look for red flags. If we find red flags, I can't diagnose environmental issues. All I can do is encourage my buyer, hey, I have a red flag. Let's look into this further. We're going to talk a little bit more about disclosure and the importance of disclosing what we know. Again, getting us closer and closer to this material fact discussion. So our roadmap for Unit 20, we're going to discuss some basic environmental hazards of which we need to be aware of and pay attention to when our little red flag gets thrown up. Like I said, if you can, once you see it, you can't unsee it. When it comes to, for example, mold, once you smell it, you can't unsmell it. So these are the kind of things we're looking for our little red flags to encourage our buyers and sellers to learn more about. Turn with me before we get started real quick in your book on page 523. 523. And what we have here is a house that, quite frankly, should be torn down because it's got all sorts of scary things going on with it. I don't think you're ever gonna, I hope you never see a property that has all of the environmental issues. But what this picture is just kind of showing us is where these environmental issues are coming from. If you were my buyer and you wanted to buy this house, I can't tell you not to, but I would highly recommend that you reconsider because this is a scary, scary home. But again, the point of it is just to kind of show us these environmental concerns that we're getting ready to talk about. These are the common areas that we can find these. So environmental issues. These are factors of growing importance with real estate transactions. Environmental issues are health issues. Health issues are people issues. Who do we work with as real estate professionals? The people. So it's important that we help educate them or provide them the information to educate themselves about these environmental issues, how they can have it tested and inspected, and know what it is that they're dealing with. So our big responsibility, we're going to learn, go ahead, a little foreshadowing here for you now. Our biggest responsibility with these environmental issues is to disclose what we know. Once we learn of an environmental issue, we have a duty to disclose it. Who can tell me real quick, what does it mean to disclose? What does it mean to disclose something?
To share.
To share. Very good, thank you. To tell, to inform, to provide information. Does that word say diagnose? That word says disclose. So my job is to say, hey, here's a potential environmental issue. Let's look into it. This is very much a stay in your lane unit. Help provide them the information so they can learn more about this environmental issue. One of the best places to start with environmental issues is the EPA's website. So we have our Environmental Protection Agency, and generally speaking, it's a great place to start outside of the resources you have here, and making sure that any of these environmental issues are addressed properly. Also, as mentioned, we're going to hear a lot of material facts in this unit. We're going to get deep dive in material facts next week. But for right now, we're just understanding that a material fact is just one that a reasonable person would consider relevant when they're making a decision. Environmental issues are everywhere. You're not going to find a property that isn't dealing with some kind of environmental issues. If your buyer says, I don't want any environmental issues, that's not generally feasible. My job is to disclose. Once I learn of an environmental issue, it's a material fact that I need to disclose for them to decide how and if they want to deal with it. So let's talk about some super scary things out there in the environment. Up first, we have asbestos. We used to build with asbestos. It's been banned, and we don't build with it anymore. About the mid-70s, it was banned. But you very well could come across it when you're dealing with a property that was built prior to the mid-70s. Asbestos is mostly used for insulation. It's this fibrous material you're seeing wrapped around the pipe here, and it can help provide insulation to the pipes, especially if pipes like down in the crawl space or something. Understand this about asbestos. All asbestos is not bad. Asbestos is only bad when it's friable. When it's friable, and again, this is what you're looking at in the picture here. When it's friable, it's breaking up and the little particles are getting into the air. And guess what? You and I breathe that air, so we breathe those particles, and those particles get into our lungs. So long-term exposure to asbestos can cause some respiratory issues, possibly lung or stomach cancer. When it comes to treating asbestos, removal isn't always the best method, because when you're removing it, you're breaking it up and you're making it friable. You're putting it out there into the environment. Now, sometimes it's not an option. For example, demolition. Before you tear the house down, before the wrecking ball shows up, the asbestos needs to be removed properly. But the preferred method for asbestos is encapsulation, which just means kind of wrapping it up. So in this case, you would wrap it back around the pipe where the little particles aren't in the air and you're breathing them in the lung. There are people out there that work with and handle asbestos. It's not my job to say removal versus encapsulation. But just understand that that's the preferred method. The least we disturb it, the better it is. Do you guys ever hear those commercials on TV? And I never say this word right, so humor me. But those commercials from the attorneys, have you or your loved one suffered from mesothelioma? Was that close enough? I see head bobs. Okay, good. Thank you. That's a hard word to say. Try it. If you or your loved one deal with that hard word, that's exposure to asbestos. That's long-term exposure to asbestos. So it might be you have somebody, family member of the construction business or something that deals with this on the regular. And again, that's that long-term exposure to asbestos. Another scary thing we have out there is lead, specifically lead-based paint. or lead found in lead pipes. Maybe some of our water pipes may have lead in the pipes, or solder. Solder is the connecting agent that connects two pieces of metal together. So that could have lead as well. The concern with lead is lead poisoning. Specifically, lead poisoning affects our children. Lead poisoning affects those developing organs. It may slow their development. It may cause damage to the brain, the developing brain, nervous system. So children and women with children, women with child, are the ones that are at risk for lead poisoning. There's the EPA has provided a booklet. Your firm will provide it for you, or you can go to the EPA's website after class. Don't go now, please. But you could go to the EPA's website after class and find this booklet about protecting your family from lead in the home. Again, helping to educate buyers and tenants if they are buying a property or renting a property and they have children that may potentially have lead in the home. This is what we need to know about lead. You need to know this year as it relates to lead-based paint. We have something called the Federal Residential Lead-Based Paint Hazard Reduction Act of 1992. You don't need to know all that. What you do need to know is that we stopped using lead, specifically lead-based paint, in residential property in 1977. The year we need to know is that anything built prior to 1978, we have got to disclose that it may have lead. Did you hear me? I'm not telling you it has lead or not. I'm telling you, because of the year it was built, it may have lead. And I can help my buyers and tenants possibly test for lead, educate them on lead by providing that booklet, getting them more information so they can make that informed decision. We have a form, lead-based paint or lead-based paint hazard addendum, that we need to attach to our sales contracts and our leases whenever we're dealing with a property that was built prior to 1978. We're going to talk more about addendums and amendments when we get into contracts. But anything built prior to 1978, we need to provide this form. As we're going on and on, we're going to learn next week, the seller doesn't have to disclose much. We're going to talk about why and what that means. I'm going to tell you right now, lead-based paint is the exception to that rule. If the seller knows, if the landlord knows of lead in the home, they need to disclose. But guys, they can only disclose what they know. And they only know if they've had it tested. Painting over lead-based paint doesn't make the lead go away. You think about a home that's been built prior to 1978, how many times has it been painted over the years? It doesn't make it go away. Lead doesn't just disappear unless it's removed by the professionals. So anything built prior to 1978, again, this form does not say, oh, your home has lead in it. This form says, because of the year your home was built, it may have lead in it. Does that make sense? I'm not making guarantees. I'm just telling you by our timeline, by the information that I know, it may. Let's look into it a little bit further. It applies only to residential. Make note of that. Commercial properties, we're not living there. We, may or may not have kids there, but they're not there all the time, right? Again, this is long-term exposure. It also applies to target housing. There are some exceptions to target housing. Target housing is most of our residential units, but some exceptions to target housing would be housing for the elderly, for example. So a retirement home wouldn't apply for lead-based paint. And before you guys get all upset, yes, of course I care about grandma. Of course I do. But remember what we just said. Lead affects those developing organs. Everybody with me? It affects children. Grandma's well developed. She's not going to get lead-based poisoning. Another exception to target housing is called zero-bedroom dwellings. Examples of zero-bedroom dwellings. studio apartments, dorm rooms, military barracks. Those are the only two exceptions, you guys. Everything else, if it was built prior to 1978, and again, please make a note, this is for sale or for lease. Don't tenants come with kids a lot of the times? So if tenants come with kids and the home was built prior to 1978, we need to help educate them as well. So here's the deal. Under the Act, anyone selling or leasing is required to disclose the presence of any known lead hazards. And if they have reports, they have a duty to provide those. If you're a do-it-yourselfer and you paint your own house, you may or may not know that you can chip off some of that paint, send it into a lab, and have it tested for lead. If you hire contracted work to come in and paint your house, they're going to chip off some of that paint. They're going to have it sent in and have it tested for lead. So if you're do-it-yourselfer, you may not know. You can only disclose, anybody can only disclose what they know. By the way, how they test for it is exactly like I said. Usually where they find it is in door frames and window frames. So they may try to go like in the window frame, like underneath where it's not an eyesore as soon as you walk into the room, and chip off a little bit of that paint, send it into a lab and have it tested. It's nothing they can do on site. It's certainly nothing you and I are qualified to do. It's something that buyers are encouraged to do as they're learning about the property, should they choose, something that tenants are encouraged to ask more about. The addendum that we're addressing here, the addendum that we're addressing here, it's kind of twofold. It serves as a seller disclosure. So the seller has to disclose what they know, if anything. And the second fold of it is a buyer representation. I have received the seller's disclosure if available. I have acknowledged this home was built prior to 1978. So it's a twofold: seller disclosure, buyer acknowledgement. One that we will talk more about when we get into contracts and Unit 10. Just residential, Jason. You can still take them to the restaurant or the mall. that what I was just referring to, where you're hired help, your contracted work, that allows them, that falls under the North Carolina Lead-Based Paint Hazard Management Program. And what this says, if you're doing any kind of renovations and being paid for it, then you have a duty to have that tested. Again, if reports and records are available, then we need to provide them to the potential buyer or tenant to help educate them. Gee, Julie, what's the big deal? Well, violation of this program could resolve in North Carolina state law, having fines up to $750 per day. Check out EPA, $32,500 per day. So we can almost expect that hired help, hired painters, contractors, etc., hopefully to have that tested. And again, once we know, we have to disclose. As we get more and more into Unit 7, in North Carolina, sellers don't have to disclose much. I used to say sellers don't have to disclose anything, but that's not accurate. Sellers don't disclose much. This is the exception. Other than that, the sellers don't have to disclose anything. More on that in Unit 8, or Unit 7. So when it comes to lead, what's our responsibility? What do we need to know? Well, we have a duty to disclose everything. I would just write that down. We disclose all material facts, as we will learn. So once we know of lead in the home, again, how do we learn about it? I don't care. Did the seller tell you? Shh, don't say anything. Even if the seller chooses not to disclose, they could face those fines. They could go down for those fines, but you and I always have that duty to disclose. And as listing agents, we need to ensure that the seller is properly completing that lead-based paint hazard addendum. that they are disclosing what they know. If you're working with a seller that says, I know, but I don't want to disclose this, shh, don't say anything. I guess my question to you is, do you really want to work with this seller? Not all people are worth the commission, you guys. And a violation of law, something that could get us both fined, it could get my license disciplined. Is it really worth it? You may not work with every buyer or seller you come across. We have decisions to make. Questions on lead-based paint in the home. 1978. What's the solution for these houses built before 78? We can have the contracted work come out and remove it. They basically got to strip it down to the wood, maybe test the wood again and see. They may have to come in and like not quite tent your house, but make it look like your house is tented because we don't want that lead dust to get out in the environment. So if we do, or when we do come across and your buyer says, I want this removed, then we need to get the experts involved, have them come in. And this could get costly. This could get very costly. Again, never look at your buyer and tenant say, oh, just paint over it, it'll be fine. Or as I've heard in the past, don't look at your buyers or tenants and say, just tell your kids not to lick the window frame and they'll be fine. It's more than that, you guys. It's so much more than that. So our job, our responsibility is just getting them to those experts. They can get estimates, they can get quotes for what this work would be to address this and possibly remove it. Okay. So let's take a break. We come back, we're going to talk about some more scary things out there in our atmosphere. just realized the next time we see each other is going to be April, isn't it? First quarter's almost gone, y'all. Can anybody tell me where it goes? Like, seriously, I'm asking. Where does it go? Why does it go so fast? How do I make it slow down? All right, cameras are on. I'm going to take attendance. And I just took attendance, so let me know that you're back, please. Okay, so lead-based paint, 1978, anything built prior to, make sure you have that, prior to 1978. Seller has to disclose what they know. We have to disclose anything we know. And we need to make sure, all I can do is make sure that the owner's in compliance with the act and completes the addendum. Another scary thing out there in the environment is radon. Radon's everywhere. Radon is a byproduct of naturally decaying matters in the ground. And as those matters decay, they release gases. Those gases look for cracks in the ground to get up and into the atmosphere. Radon's everywhere. Walk out in your front yard. There's a crack in your ground and radon's coming up out of there. I can almost promise. The problem with radon is when those cracks in the ground are under your home. Now that radioactive gas, that byproduct, is getting up into your home. So the only way to know if there's radon in your home is to test for it. It's odorless, it's tasteless, it's clear. The only way to know if there's radon in any property is to test for it. The EPA has set 4.0 picocuries and more as undesirable. So if we have the property tested, if the buyer chooses to do that as part of their inspections, and they had the property tested, and it's more than 4.0 picocuries, then we may have to address having a radon mitigation system put into place. The radon mitigation system is what you're looking at here in this picture. You guys see that little white pipe running out the side of the home? So the end of this pipe is like drilled into the crawl space here. And there's fans in this pipe that pull the air from the crawl space up into the atmosphere where it belongs, as opposed to the property. Radon kind of comes and goes. Again, matters decaying today may not be decaying tomorrow. There may not be anything decaying there today. So radon kind of comes and goes. Some of you very well may own a home with a radon mitigation system already in it. You still want to be encouraged to have that tested periodically, because the little fans in the mitigation system don't last forever. So having it tested, you can go to like Lowe's or Home Depot and get like a kit, a radon test kit, to see if it, give you a good place to start, if you will. But typically speaking, the buyer's going to choose to have this tested as part of their inspections. The test. They bring their contraction in. Usually the home inspector can test for radon. And they bring their contraction in and they set it up in the home. And like every hour, it takes like a snapshot of the radon level. And at the end of 2 or 3 days, it gives us an average. If that average is more than 4.0 picocuries, then we got an issue that we need to consider having mitigated. Again, it's in the air. We breathe that air, so that gets into our respiratory, affects our lungs. Those that come into this with respiratory issues may have a higher, maybe more sensitive to radon. Anything over 4.0 picocuries is not only undesirable, but it's also material fact. So if at any point we learn that it's set over 4.0 picocuries, then we have a duty to disclose that. Vacant homes tend to have higher levels of radon than occupied homes, because ventilation can help with radon as well. Homes are meant to be lived in. And think about your own home. I mean, how many times a day does the door open and close? How many times a day does your AC and your heat kick on? Do you open your windows? That kind of ventilation allows for air to move through. If you get a vacant home where nobody goes in ever, you might be tightly sealed, and you may have a higher level of radon. Again, we don't know until and if we decide to have it tested. New construction, we're building homes very tightly sealed today to help with energy costs. Some builders are just go ahead and building homes with radon mitigation systems already in place, address it before it becomes an issue. But again, bottom line, the only way to know for sure is to have it tested. This is a map. This is from a continuing education class, I think 2017. So it might be a little outdated, but this just kind of shows us that radon is everywhere. The closer to the mountains you get, the more susceptible to radon you're going to get because of the surface. I mean, think about down at the beach, we're dealing with a lot of sand, and that gas has a lot more places to go. You get up into the mountains with the rock and the stone, it doesn't have as many releases, as many traps. You could have a home tested for radon and not have an issue. The home next door could test high. So just because your neighbor tested low for radon is no guarantee that yours will or not. Again, the only way to know is to have that tested. And like I said, those little radon mitigation fans don't last forever. Buyers should always be encouraged to have the radon tested as part of their investigations, even if there is a mitigation system in place. I was shown property once. There was a mitigation system in the basement. I mean, we pointed at it. We talked about it. We had a conversation standing right there in front of it. My buyer said, what's the cost? And it was like, I don't know, 150 bucks, give or take. And they said, oh, that's nothing. We'll have it tested. And it came back at like 6 point something. So I called the listing agent. The listing agent called the seller. The seller called their radon mitigation guy. And he came out, lo and behold, those little fans weren't working. So he replaced the fans. We had it retested, and now we're back down to 2 something. So just because you see a radon mitigation system is no guarantee that there's not high levels of radon. Again, always encourage your buyers to have that tested. So when it comes to radon and us and what we need to know, like we said, we have a duty to disclose. This is a material fact. Once we learn, if we learn of the radon being 4.0 picocuries or higher, just because you see a radon mitigation system is not a material fact, but it should cause your little red flag to go up. It should cause that little red flag to go up for you to look at your buyers and say, you should have this tested. Little red flag to look at your sellers before you list the property to say, when was the last time you guys had this tested? Ask questions. That's what those little red flags mean. They're encouraging us to ask questions. You may have, let's say you're a listing agent, you list a property for sale, property goes under contract, and during the buyer's inspections, they learn that the radon level is 6 or 12, whatever. Not only in North Carolina do sellers not have to disclose much, the other piece about sellers in North Carolina is they don't have to repair anything. They don't have to fix a thing. They don't have to change a light bulb if they don't want to. We're going to learn in Unit 7 that homes in North Carolina are sold as is, unless agreed otherwise. So let's say you're a listing agent, you go under contract, buyer has it inspected, and we get a high radon level. Buyer asks the seller to put in a mitigation system, and the seller says, no, I'm not going to. That's their right. They don't have to in North Carolina. Buyer says, well, I'm going to exercise my right. I'm going to terminate. So the contract gets terminated. We go back on the market. Listing agents, don't you now have a material fact on your hand? Don't you now know that that radon level is 6.0 or higher? And that's what it means for material fact. I have to disclose that now that I know we're back on the market. I have to disclose that to the next potential buyers. I would also have a conversation with my sellers, because one thing I know for sure, is one, I have to disclose, and two, radon doesn't go away in a timely manner on its own. So if they don't want to deal with it with this buyer, they're going to have to deal with it with the next one, possibly the next one. You know, bottom line, it's up to the sellers. I know we have a lot of questions about that little scenario I just gave you. That's kind of the foreshadowing for where we're getting in the next couple units. Talking about our responsibilities in those situations, talking about the buyer's right to terminate, talking about the seller's right not to repair. A whole bunch of foreshadowing coming up. Back to radon. Questions on radon? Good question. Radon detection concerns for basement and crawl spaces only? No. At least with basements and crawl spaces, you have more where for the air to go. If you're on a slab, the only where it has to go is up into the home. So you're going to deal with it, could deal with it in any type of property. If they have to put in a mitigation system in a property on a slab, now they're actually drilling into the home and not the foundation to put that system in, because we want to pull that air out and send it out into the atmosphere where it belongs, where it is anyway. Another environmental concern is formaldehyde. We're still using this today. We find this a lot of in our pressed wood products. So think like particle board, plywood. It's also found a lot in glues and furniture. So whatever's holding furniture together. Formaldehyde is, it's a gas found in these products. Again, it gets into the air. Ventilation is huge, you guys, is huge for a lot of these issues, and moisture control, etc. Formaldehyde was banned early 80s, but since then the ban has been reduced to a warning because there is no concrete evidence. It's probable that it could cause cancer, but there is no concrete evidence. So the ban has been lifted to a warning. And again, we're finding it. I had a lady in a pre-licensing class last year that said she bought a bed, and like a bed frame, and there was a tag on it, big red tag that said, warning, this may have formaldehyde. And she said, it scared me a little bit. I said, well, they were warning you. That's reduced to the warning, encouraging you to do your own inspections and investigations and determine how you feel about that. So we use it today. Where are my High Point people? Anybody? I think we're getting ready for High Point Furniture Market. So it's probably getting ready to be a whole bunch of formaldehyde in the in the area in the next couple of weeks when the furniture market comes to town. Another environmental concern, this is a pretty big one. Underground storage tanks. Underground storage tanks are generally steel. Over time, steel corrodes. The contents in the tank, once it's corroded, can leak out. What do you have in the tank? Oil, gas, for example. Once these tanks leak and the contents in the tank gets out, then it's going to go wherever the water goes, wherever the groundwater flows. Formaldehyde. So once it leaks, it gets out into our groundwater. It can contaminate our groundwater. It can contaminate your neighbor's yard, your neighbor's neighbors, etc. When they find contaminants, they're going to trace it back to the source. And if the source is on your property, then you're responsible for the cleanup, any damage that it caused, not just on your property, but others as well. There are funds in place to assist with this. So you're not totally on your own, but it can get expensive. It can get timely and costly. What we can do as agents with underground storage tanks, if one is in use, if one is still in use, then somewhere in the yard, there's going to be a pipe sticking out of the yard. So if you're walking in somebody's backyard and you trip over a pipe, your little red flag needs to go up, cause you to ask some questions. The big problem with these are the abandoned ones. Once upon a time ago, we thought out of sight, out of mind, right? I'm not using the storage tank anymore, so let's just bury it. It's not a problem anymore. Now we know better. It's estimated that there are millions of abandoned storage tanks throughout the United States. I'm not expected to go dig up somebody's yard looking for an underground storage tank. We're not expected to run around with our metal detector looking for an underground storage tank. However, if we learn of one, like I said, if you see a pipe sticking out of the yard somewhere, that's a pretty good indication. If you see stained soil, that's a pretty good indication that there's an underground storage tank nearby. Cleanup. Again, we can get some aid. There's federal regulations, there's state regulations, but it's got to be handled properly. Don't tell your buyers to just get a funnel and some kitty litter and that'll take care of it. It's more involved than that. So we get the professionals in to assist. And we have an act that we'll see briefly on page 534. The North Carolina Leaky Petroleum Underground Storage Tank Cleanup Act. Again, my duty, my job is to disclose what I know. So once we learn of an underground storage tank, we have a duty to disclose that. So for us, if we know of a current or a previous underground storage tank, we have to disclose to all prospective buyers or tenants. And when or if we do find a tank, then the buyer should be encouraged to have somebody come in and inspect the tank, check out the contaminants of the tank, make sure it's in good shape. Again, once they find a leak, they're going to trace it back to its source. And if its source is on your property, you're responsible for it. Even if you didn't know about it, even if you bought it and had no idea, is everybody with me? It's always going to be the responsibility of the current owner. But there are plans in action. Make a note. There's a fascinating story in your book on page 529, an example. Make a note to look at that. Please don't do it now, but make a note to look at that because that just kind of goes to show, in this case, some underground storage tanks affected a whole town. And I just find this absolutely, if you haven't had a chance yet, again, please don't try to do it now. You may also come across above ground storage tanks. Those are a lot easier to see. Again, little red flag going up. Maybe they're in use, maybe they're not. All I can do is ask some questions. Questions on specifically our underground storage tank, UST, underground storage tank. Another environmental concern that we deal with on the regular is mold. Mold's everywhere. Y'all take a big deep breath with me. You probably just breathed in some kind of mold. Mold ranges. I got you, didn't I? Sorry. Mold ranges. Mold ranges from that mold on that loaf of bread you've had too long to black toxic mold and so many strains and variations in between. Mold can be a concern. Again, respiratory issues because it's air that we're breathing in. Specifically, toxic mold is the concern. And mold doesn't need much to grow. All it needs is a little bit of moisture, a little bit of oxygen, and it can grow, and it can grow quickly, and it can grow rapidly. So mold can be found anywhere. Moisture and oxygen, that's all we need. Ventilation helps help keep that air dry. But if we ever discover signs or we find out from the owner that there's been a previous flood or a previous leak, that's a good recipe for possible mold. You might walk into a basement. Have you ever walked into an unfinished basement and think, this smells basement-y. There is no scent called basement-y. What you're smelling is some kind of mold or mildew. Again, little red flag, go up. Mold can be a concern for new construction. Absolutely, it could be, especially while it's still being built. I mean, guys, how much rain have we had this winter? Is anybody else sick and tired of rain? Please stop raining, right? So with all this rain and new construction, all we need is some moisture and some oxygen. Now, hopefully they're identifying it right before they finish the construction, but it really doesn't take much. Again, I'm just running around looking for little red flags, asking questions. Straight up ask the seller, have you guys had any floods or leaks? When you smell something, mold's the one thing you can smell. Your little red flag should go up. The other important thing for us to know about mold to help educate our buyers is that insurance companies, homeowners insurance companies, not many of them have coverage for mold anymore. So if there is mold, that's something that the homeowner probably will have to address on their own. Insurance won't take care of it. And again, we need more than a bottle of bleach, especially with toxic mold. It's not just a matter of spritzing some bleach on it, expecting it to go away. So when it comes to mold, what do we need to know as brokers? The Real Estate Commission says the mere presence of mold isn't a material fact because mold is everywhere. So if that was the case, we'd be disclosing it everywhere. It doesn't become a material fact unless it's an excessive amount. What's an excessive amount? When you can see it, when you can smell it, when you can tell that it's there just by walking in the room. And we need to be on the lookout for these little red flags. Floods, leaks, water damage. So when it comes to addressing any of these environmental issues, we have something out there called CERCLA, which is our Comprehensive Environmental Response Compensation and Liability Act. And this is what provides cleanup for some of these environmental issues. And if you look with me in your book, flip over to page 534. We can see some programs that CERCLA provides. So there's our Leaky Petroleum Underground Storage Tank Cleanup Act, Coastal Area Management Act, Mountain Ridge Protection Act, Dredge and Fill Act, and Sediment Pollution Control Act. Again, this is all Green Star stuff. Just giving you that basic understanding. It's not unlikely at some point in your real estate career, you're going to deal with an environmental issue. It's very likely. It just happens there. It's everywhere. So your buyers and sellers look at you and say, oh, what do I do? Be the source of the source, you guys. Get them the information they need. So we talked about the lead-based paint booklet. We got CERCLA. We got these acts. Like I said, EPA's website is a great place to start. So bottom line, with any of these environmental concerns, liability, the owner is going to carry the most liability. The owner, the current owner, is always going to be liable for cleanup, even if it's caused by the previous owner. No, they're not going to ask you to identify an acronym on your tests. So even though the owner carries the most liability, that doesn't mean you and I are entirely off the hook. As brokers, when it comes to these environmental issues, disclose, disclose, disclose. Once we know, once we learn of something, maybe the seller tells us, maybe the buyer has an inspection and gets a report. I don't care how you find out about it. But once we find out about it, we have this duty to disclose. Failure to disclose could result in disciplinary action by the Real Estate Commission. Who can remind me what the Real Estate Commission's main purpose is? I see mouths move. Their main purpose is to protect the public. So how can we protect the public? By disclosing what we know, by encouraging them to look into these environmental issues, environmental concerns. I'm not protecting the public by hiding my head in the sand and pretending I didn't know about it. Does that make sense? Once we know, we have this duty to disclose. Failure to disclose means you're not protecting the commission's public. So we need to be aware. We need to be on the lookout for those little red flags. Again, when you're showing property, you go in the basement, you step in an inch of water, look before you step. But you step in an inch of water, you smell that basementy smell, little red flag to encourage them to investigate and to learn. And that gets us through our super scary unit. Key terms, there's more in unit 20 than what we need to know. You may, because there's some other good stuff in here too about landfills and carbon monoxide. So you may want to flip through it, but what we covered is what's in the syllabus. What's in the syllabus is a candidate for a state exam question. Unit 20 is not the heavily tested unit, just creating awareness and helping us identify our duties when it comes to these environmental issues. Disclose, disclose, disclose. Questions on unit 20. Good? They're good? Thumbs ups? Head bobs? Take either one? Awesome. Y'all want a Kahoot? Grab your phones. Let's play a game. This Kahoot will kind of wrap up the first section of this class. I think the online learning system refers to the end of unit 20 as the first 25%. So we've made it a quarter of the way through. So we're going to Kahoot on units 4 through 6. The easiest way to get into Kahoot is using the QR code. Just scan that QR code. If you downloaded the app the last time or you're going to the website, you need a game pin. That game pin is 8995919 for this game. And again, I'm fine if you want to use nicknames for Kahoot. Use a nickname. I may ask you who you are, and you can tell me in a private chat, so just between me and you. I think Kahoot lets you guys now choose your avatar. Please don't spend all our time selecting your avatar. Whatever they give you, you're good with, right? Yep. And I'll never make you Kahoot. So if you don't want to play via Kahoot, that's fine. I just ask if you don't want to play via Kahoot on your phones, just play in your mind. Kind of a good indication of how you're doing. Everybody in that wants to play? Your phone just went dark. Wake it back up. You ready? Let's Kahoot. Again, units 4 through 6. Couple questions from each, just to wrap this section up. Question number 1. The system of legal description that defines a parcel of land by its parameter is the... seconds. Which one defines it by the parameter? Good job, guys. It's the meets and bounds. The meets and bounds is the one that starts at the point of beginning and it ends at the point of beginning, and it gives you a tour of the property. It walks you around the parameter, the property lines, and it gives you the tour of the property. Meets and bounds is the one most commonly used in North Carolina. The only other one we're going to use in North Carolina is the lot and block, also known as the plat map, if a plat map is available. If it's in a subdivision and the developer created it, then we have a plat map. If not, meets and bounds. And this is the only way to identify the property lines. Questions on this one? So let's see who got it right the fastest. Ashley came out the gate, followed by Stephanie and Jason. Mia, that's right, and Amari. Question number 2. In a North Carolina real estate transaction, excise taxes are the responsibility of the... 10 seconds. Who pays excise taxes? The seller. They're going to pay taxes when they sell it. I always remember it. They tax you when you buy it. They tax you while you own it. And guess what? They got one more opportunity to tax you when you go to sell it. And those are called excise taxes. They will get their money. Don't worry about them. Questions on excise taxes. 5/100ths of the purchase price. So let's see what we did. Shuffled up a bit. Stephanie's now on top. Amari's up. Lorraine's on the board. Is it Mari is on the board? Dustin's on the board. S is our highest climber, up 7 places this round. Question number 3, which of the following deeds contains no express or implied warranties? A no warranty deed. Seconds. What's our no warranty deed? The quitclaim deed. The quitclaim deed is used for like a correction. Maybe the address was wrong. Maybe my name was misspelled. Maybe we're creating an easement. Maybe I got married and I want to create Tennessee by the entirety. Maybe I got divorced and I want to take my husband's name off the deed. Quitclaim deed says what I got, you get. No warranties. So if I got nothing, what you going to get? Absolutely nothing. That's all the quitclaim deed says. There are no warranties. The general warranty deed has the most. And that's the one we're going to see the most often out in the wild. That's the one that has the most warranties from the seller, offers the greatest protection to the buyer. Questions on this one? Shuffled up again. So we got Amari, Lorraine's up, Dustin's up, Mayari is on the board, Mia's back on. Alini's our highest climber this round at 4 places. Question number 4. Which of the following is an essential element of a valid deed? Required ingredients. Five seconds. What's the judge looking for to determine the validity of the deed? Let's all turn to our books. Let's go back to page 87 and talk about those essential elements that the judge is looking for to determine the validity. So we can see on page 87, the judge needs it to be in writing. The grantor has to have legal capacity. The grantee is named. There's got to be our words of conveyance. This is the answer we were looking for here. We have to have a legal description. It's got to be signed by the grantor. And then it's got to be delivered and voluntarily accepted by the grantee. The fact that it may or may not have a seal, the fact that it may or may not be recorded is not an essential element. Are our deeds recorded? Do our deeds get recorded? Everybody shake your head yes. We just said, we spent unit 5 talking about how deeds are public record, right? So are deeds recorded? Yeah. But it's not the validity of a deed that requires the deed to be recorded. It's the Connor Act that steps in and says our deeds have to be recorded. So remember, we have our required ingredients on page 87. And then on page 88, we have the extra things that make it better. Questions on this one? The mustard color one, the grantor signs, not the grantee. We're good. 87, 88. Whenever we hear, because we're going to talk more about validity of documents, we're going to talk about a valid contract when we get into units 9 and 10. Whenever we're talking about the validity of a document, that's the judge's job, is to determine the validity. And we're talking about those essential elements, which are the pieces that they are looking for. Questions? So we got Lorraine's on the board, or up, excuse me, Pierre's on the board, Amari's still on, Dustin's on, Mayari's on. A couple of you lost your answer streak. That's okay. That's okay. We'll get it back. Number 5, restrictive covenants. Seven seconds. Restrictive covenants are appurtenant. What does it mean to be appurtenant? They apply to and bind all successive owners of the properties. The first one that buys in the subdivision has to abide by the covenants. All other future owners have to follow those covenants. The developer leaves, they go on to the next subdivision, the covenants remain. They leave those covenants behind. It's the rules, if you will, of the neighborhood, of the subdivision. Questions on this one? So we got Lorraine still on top, Dustin's up, Pierre's still on, Mari's still on, Mari's back on. Sean is our highest climber, up 3 places this round. Number 6, the primary intent of zoning is to primary intent. Six seconds. Primary intent of zoning is to control how we use the land. One product of zoning might be a buffer zoning that separates residential from commercial, but that's not its main purpose. Also remember to you guys with the blue one, zoning is local in nature. So when it comes to zoning, there are no statewide ordinances. Each city, county, town, municipality creates their own zoning. It's local. Questions on this one? So we have Dustin's on top now, followed by Alini and Mari. Mari's still on. Pierre's on fire this round. You got an answer streak of 6. And our last one, which of the following best describes a variance? Eight seconds. Variance is an exception to zoning ordinance. Everybody show me how many homeowners can apply for a zoning or for a variance. How many homeowners can apply for a variance? Just one and only one. That one homeowner has to prove a hardship. And if they're granted a variance, they're given permission to break the rules. Questions? Yep. All right, let's see how we did. Third place winner is Dustin. Second place winner is Amari. And our first place winner of this Kahoot is Alini. I got 4th and 5th runners up of Mia and Mari. Good Kahoot, you guys. Pay attention to some of those words. Like, for example, the last question, we just saw the word best. Does that mean there could be another good answer? Sure. You're not looking for all the good answers. You're looking for the best one. If I could word that another way, you're looking for the least wrong answer. So we're looking for the best of what we have available, or we're looking for the one least wrong. I say that to say, again, I know you guys, and sometimes you will argue with a test question. You can only deal with the answer choices given to you. You may know there's a better choice out there, but if it's not available, you can't go with it. Does that make sense? Focus on the question, focus on the answer choices, stay out of the what if trap. What about, what if, remove that stuff from your vocabulary. Who finds yourself going, well, what about this? Stop it. The question is looking at you. I promise you, I guarantee you, the information you need to answer this question is there. You don't need to read into it. Anything else? Wrapping up? 1 through 6 and 20? Okay, let's take a break. We come back, moving forward. Welcome back. The cameras are on. I'm going to take attendance. Let's talk about what's getting ready to happen. We are, as I mentioned last week, we are getting ready to get started in Unit 7. We're going to introduce you to Unit 7. We'll probably be most of next week in Unit 7. If you haven't written this down yet, please do so right now. Units 7, 8, 9, and 10 are heavily tested units. 7, 8, 9, and 10. 7 and 8 is all about agency. The big flashing light out of your way. 7 and 8 is all about agency. 9 and 10 is all about contracts, specifically our sales contract, also known as our offer to purchase and contract. It is my belief that when you guys signed up for this class, you thought what you were signing up for was 7, 8, 9, and 10, agency and contracts. So we're slowing down. We're slowing down because we've got a lot to cover. We're getting ready to see lots of red stars, and we're getting into some heavily tested material. I'm really going to start encouraging you guys to look ahead. You need to review. You need to review agency. We need to make sure we understand agency because this is the relationship that you're creating with your buyers and sellers. I've mentioned the way to the exam. I've mentioned heavily tested. I've mentioned red stars. I think it's one thing to mention it. I think it's another thing to show you my source and where I get this information that I mentioned to you. So I want to take just a few minutes before we jump into 7. And I want to look at a couple things in the online learning system that you guys have available to you. And you can help maybe better align your study portion. So a couple things. First off, in the welcome section, we have said on several occasions that the syllabus provides us with what we need to know what's going to be on your state exam. The Real Estate Commission hands us the syllabus, and they say, if your students know what's in the syllabus, then you are preparing them for the state exam. And as I told you guys, I wrote this class with the syllabus in my hand. So you don't need to worry about if we're talking about something that's not being tested. If we're talking about it, it's a possible candidate for your exam. They just updated the syllabus a few weeks ago. The alignment is off a little bit from this class. Not worried about the order, just so long as we get the material, the information. Within the syllabus, if we scroll down just a bit, and I'll let you guys flip through this, but if we scroll down just a little bit, the syllabus starts talking about level 1 topics, level 2 topics, and level 3 topics. Level 1 topics are what we have identified as green star. You guys know my PowerPoints have that star in the upper right-hand corner. Where do I get that color? It comes straight from the syllabus. So if the syllabus calls it a level 1, I call it a green star. If the syllabus calls it a level 2, I call it a yellow star. And if the syllabus calls it a level 3, then I call it a red star. As mentioned, we're getting ready to see lots of red stars. They're going to ask you questions about agency. Sure, they have to. They have to make sure you have an understanding of agency before they let you go be an agent. Makes sense, right? We're getting ready to see lots of level 3 topics in agency because it's one thing to be able to define the word, i.e. level 1, but we're going to get to a level with agency that we're analyzing it. We can apply it in a situation, which is a lot of your exam. It's an application exam. I get asked a lot, is this an open book test? No. But even if it were, because it's an application exam, you're not going to be able to look the stuff up. Does that make sense? They're going to put you in a situation, in an agency situation, and have you apply it to answer these test questions. So we're going to start with defining the words. We're going to have a basic understanding of what the words mean. And then a lot of the detail we're getting into, specifically in agency, we're getting into this deep level 3 analysis information. So that's one source I have for you guys. Again, I encourage you to flip through the syllabus, at least the first couple part, the introduction. And then you can see as it goes down, it gives you like this is level 1 material. So that's how we know to give it a green star, red star, yellow star. My other source of information is a booklet provided by the North Carolina Real Estate Commission. And it's called Real Estate Licensing in North Carolina. This is the booklet that answers that says, yay, I passed Julie's class. Now what do I do? This is the booklet that walks you through the application process, step-by-step guides on how to apply for your state exam, what you do when you first get your license. You guys were sent this when you signed up for this class. Lane sent you an introductory email, and this was an attachment in that email. I know she asked you guys to look it over. I just want to point out, this booklet, again, updated a few weeks ago. So the email you have from Lane, the booklet's out of date. I need you to come to the online learning system to look at this booklet. We're going to look into this booklet together once we get through the end of Unit 10. So give me a couple more weeks and we'll talk about that application process. We'll talk about what you need to know to go take your state exam, that kind of thing. Everybody good with that? Bear with me. We'll do a deep dive in this booklet. You have it now, though. In the online learning system, so why not go ahead and read through it? There's testable points in this booklet as well that we'll discuss. With that being said, I'm going to scroll through a bit. We're going to fast forward. And the other thing I've mentioned is the weight of the topics. So what do I mean by that? The syllabus on page, I'm sorry, not the syllabus, the Real Estate Licensing in North Carolina booklet on page 17 tells us, it gives us the breakdown of how many questions you can expect to see in each topic. So there's our national section and the topics. You guys can see contracts and agency. Number 4, you can expect to see 16 questions on contracts and agency in your national section. That's pretty direct, isn't it? They're being pretty transparent with you guys. If we look at the state section, you can expect to see 16 questions on agency. So on your state exam, what I'm telling you guys is you can expect to see about 25 to 30, I'd say, test questions just on unit 7 and 8. So when I talk about heavily tested, when I talk about red stars, I'm not making this stuff up, you guys. This comes from a legit place. It comes straight from the commission. And as long as we're following this, then we know what we're dealing with matters of importance. We've also briefly mentioned post-licensing. I will talk more about post-licensing specifically when we get into our RELATE book. And then at the end, we get into state-specific stuff. So we'll talk about post-licensing. But just for now, no. Right now, you're in a 75-hour pre-licensing class. Once you get your license, you have to take 90 hours of post-licensing. And those 90 hours of post-licensing are broken down into 3 topics. And just so you know, one of those topics in post-licensing is agency. One of those topics in post-licensing is contracts. And the other topic in post-licensing is state-specific material. What's specific just to North Carolina? 3 of your biggest tested units or biggest tested sections in your exams, you're going to get further information on in post-licensing. Does that make sense? Again, just to reiterate the importance of these topics, 7, 8, 9, and 10 that we're getting ready to head into. I opened a can of worms. Is there a post-licensing test? Yes, each post-licensing class has a test that you also have to pass. Back to agency, back to contracts, back to units 7, 8, 9, and 10. Is everybody hearing the importance? I'm not making this stuff up for the sake of making this stuff up. You're going to get tested on agency. You're going to get tested on contracts. And you know what part of this class is really real world? Agency and contracts. Like we said on day 1, you're not going to use everything you learn in pre-licensing. I'm telling you, you're not going to have a full-blown conversation with somebody about a deed in the real world. We're just getting basic understanding. but we are going to have full-blown conversation about agency contracts, etc. So after this class, we have to take post licensing. Yes, once you get your license, there are 90 hours of post licensing. So is everybody good? Do I have everybody on board? How many of you looked ahead at Unit 7, started looking ahead at Unit 7? I hope to see a whole bunch of hands go up. I wish I saw more. Please take time this weekend to get through, spend some time in Unit 7. Like I said, you guys, we're going to start it right now. We're going to be in Unit 7 all next week. We're going to spend about a week in Unit 8 as well. Deep, deep, deep stuff. So with that being said, here we go. Unit 7 is the brokerage relationship, specifically the laws and the practice of the brokerage relationship. In Unit 7, we are understanding agency. We got to define agency. We got to define the different scenarios that we're allowed to work as an agent. We're going to talk about creating that agency. In Unit 8, we get more into specifics about our agency agreements. We get more into specifics about working with sellers and buyers. We also get more specific into your commission. Please don't ask me about your commission in Unit 7. We'll talk about your commission in Unit 8. I can't pay you until you understand and properly handle agency. So we got to get through 7, and then I promise you we'll talk about your commission. So put that off to the side. So our brokerage relationships, the laws and practices, a lot going on. This slide is really not that helpful. This whole unit, we're going to explain agency, and we have different types of relationships, how we can work with buyers, how we can work with sellers. We mentioned landlords and tenants a little bit, but one of these agency discussions, it's very heavily focused on residential sales transactions. So the different types of agency relationships that we can have. We're going to differentiate between a customer and a client. I can take my entire market, and I can divide all consumers into 2 categories. You're either my customer or you're my client. So we're going to talk about the difference, and then we're going to talk about what duties I owe for each. There's our deep dive into a material fact. We're going to talk specifically things that are considered a material fact in North Carolina, things that are not considered a material fact, and what our responsibility and role is with a material fact. And then we're going to talk about my duty to disclose my agency status. So we have a brochure called Working with Real Estate Agent Disclosure, and what my duty is with the consumer to let them know where I stand in this transaction. Do I represent somebody in this transaction? Kind of give them the heads up. So before we really get into it, I just want to introduce you guys to some points that we'll discuss. Just put your pencils down for a minute. Everything you're getting ready to see, we will discuss later in this unit. But I think having some things early on to help wrap our brains around this information, things to start having settle, will make these discussions a little bit easier to follow. So just listen for a minute with me. North Carolina is a caveat emptor state. Here's your Latin lesson for the day. Caveat emptor means let the buyer beware. Remember when I said earlier that the seller doesn't have to disclose much? How do they get away with it? Because we are a caveat emptor state. It is not the seller's responsibility to disclose. The onus to learn about the property is on the buyer. And when the buyer hires an agent, we take on that responsibility with them. Caveat emptor means let the buyer beware. Also, as mentioned earlier, homes sold in North Carolina are as is, which means what does the seller have to repair? What are they required to fix? As is means you buy it like it is. Anything's negotiable. Could the seller agree to do some repairs? Sure. but that's a negotiation between the buyer and the seller. Homes are as is. So the seller doesn't have to disclose, the seller doesn't have to fix. North Carolina is a great place to be a seller, huh? We do have some protections for the buyer, some things the buyer to be aware. We're building it, we're working on it. When the consumer hires us, they don't hire us, the individual. The consumer hires the firm. My sales firm allows me to work with their buyers. My sales firm allows me to work with their sellers. The agency relationship is not with the individual broker. It is with the consumer and the firm. The consumer hires the firm through the use of an agency agreement. As it stands right now, in a typical transaction, the seller pays the listing firm. The listing firm shares their commission with whomever brings the buyer. Now, this very well could change with that NAR settlement that we mentioned the first of the week. That thing is still pending. Nothing can happen until July. All we can do is what we know right now. So right now, what do we know? Seller typically pays the listing firm, and then the listing firm shares some of their commission with the firm that brings the buyer. An exception, or an exception to this today might be if the buyer is interested in a property that's for sale by owner. For sale by owner means that they're going on at their own. They didn't hire a firm. There is no requirement for the seller, for the for sale by owner, to pay a buyer's agent. In that case, always remember this, you guys. There are only two parties to the transaction, the buyer and the seller. So if that for sale by owner isn't going to pay you as a buyer's agent, who's the only other person in the transaction that can pay you? The buyer. So if the seller's not going to pay you, the buyer will. And guess what? Today, how you get paid, when you get paid, and who is going to pay you is all covered in our agency agreements that we'll see in Unit 8. Our agency agreements are our employment contracts that dictate when we get paid, how we get paid, etc. We will look briefly at our agency agreements when we get to Unit 8. So we'll talk about when you earn your commission and who is going to pay you. We'll see that verbiage. And as we've been saying, we are fact finders. I help gather the facts so they can make an informed decision. I'm not the one buying this house. I'm not the one taking on a 30-year mortgage with BB&T. Is everybody with me? All I can do is give you that information, help you gather that information, in that case, the buyer, so the buyer can make an informed decision. The other thing we need to start discussing is some of the verbiage. We see it more and more when we get into Unit 8, but I don't think it's a bad idea to introduce us to the verbiage now. So again, there's only two parties to the transaction, the buyer and the seller. What our role is, what we're called depends on our role. So we have the buyer's agent or the buyer's firm working with the buyer. May also be referred to as the selling agent and the selling firm. You are selling this property to the buyer. If you're working with the seller, you could be called the seller's agent or the seller's firm. You could also be referred to as the listing agent or the listing firm. The ings, the selling and the listing, that is verbiage used in our agency agreement and our sales contract. That's the proper verbiage. We just tend to run around talk about buyer's agents and seller's agents. But we need to introduce you to what it's called so we can interpret and understand these forms. We're going to see this a couple more times. Again, specifically as we get into Unit 8 and we start seeing and introducing you to those forms, the agency agreement. The last thing I have to say before we really get started. I don't ask you guys, there's license law, and then there's commission rule. License law is a North Carolina general statute. They vote on law down at Congress. Commission rule is created by the Real Estate Commission. We as licensees have to follow license law and commission rule. And we're talking about law and rule. We're starting to introduce you to law and rule. I don't ask you guys to read much with law and rule, but one rule I think you should read is Commission Rule A.0104, which is all about our agency agreements and disclosures. I have this for you in the online learning system under the Julie folder. Commission Rule 58A.0104. It's a rule. It's not an easy read. Break it up into chunks. Read a paragraph or a section at a time. Once you read it, I think you should go back and read it again. And when you read it a second time, go back and read it again. What the heck? You're on a roll. Read it again and again and again. Because Commission Rule 58A.0104 covers the commission, the North Carolina Real Estate Commission rule that addresses agency agreements and disclosure. Again, within these sections, we're also starting to introduce you to more and more law and rule. The very real world piece of it starts now. Do I have any questions or comments before we begin officially? I was just ready to jump into agency, right? I love it. Let's do it. All right, beginning of Unit 7. Talking about brokerage and agency. We kind of all follow what's referred to as the common law of agency. Don't let the name fool you. The common law of agency isn't just one law. It's actually comprised of comes from several different sources. The law of agency governs or defines how we represent other people in a brokerage transaction. The law of agency, the idea of it kind of started back in the days of England when everybody served a king, and how we serve that king and the duties that we owe that king. Fast forward into today, contract law, our agency agreements regulate how we represent other people. Previous court cases, we're going to talk about one in just a second, define how we represent other people in a brokerage transaction. And then as mentioned, we have license law, which is a North Carolina general statute, specifically General Statute 93A. Don't need to know that, just there for reference. And then the North Carolina Real Estate Commission also has the ability to create their own rule, and that's what's referred to as commission rule, which is Chapter 58A. Somewhere between now and the next week or so, I'm going to take you out to the commission's website. We're going to introduce you to a few things out there, and specifically, I'm going to show you guys where you can access license law and commission rule. Because at some point in your career, once you get your license, you may find yourself asking, what does the Real Estate Commission say about this? And the answer to that question will be found in license law and commission rule. So I need to teach you guys how to fish. I want to teach you how to find this information. Years from now, you're out in the real world, and you need to know. We're going to teach you where you can find that information. Show you where you can find that information. There's speaking of lawsuits, there's a lawsuit starting at the beginning of Unit 7, and it's the Adena lawsuit. And this is a very important lawsuit that changed the way many states practiced agency, including North Carolina. Prior to the Adena lawsuit, buyer's agency didn't exist, which means buyers would buy houses without representation. Prior to this lawsuit, all licensees represented the best interest of The seller. The best way I know how to describe real estate before this lawsuit, has anybody ever gone to a car lot to buy a car? And you're walking around the car lot and that salesman kind of pops up out of nowhere like, hey folks, how you doing today, right? Like, where'd you come from? Who does that car salesman represent? Do they have your best interest? No, they represent the dealer, right? That they're working for. Who are they trying to sell a car for? Not for you. They're trying to sell it for the dealer. So what happens, you walk all over that car lot and you don't see a car that you like. What do? You thank the man and you go on to the next car lot and see what inventory they have. And if you don't like a car there, you go on to the next and on to the next and on to the next. Prior to buyer's agency in this state, that was how real estate was handled. When you wanted to buy a house, you went to the real estate firm. They showed you your inventory. If you liked something, you would buy something. If you didn't, you would go on to the next real estate firm and on to the next. So there was this case, it was in Minnesota, the Sedina lawsuit, and it was discovered, there was somebody that sued this real estate firm because they felt, based on the agent's actions, they felt that this agent and this firm had their best interest. They felt like they were represented. And at the end of the transaction, they realized that they weren't. So they enacted this lawsuit. And we know how some of these Class A lawsuits go sometimes, right? Now you have 500 other people stand up and go, oh yeah, me too. I felt like I was represented too. And this thing turned into a huge, huge lawsuit. The outcome for this real estate firm, they ended up settling for $19.9 million. What that lawsuit did was it caused other states, including North Carolina, all over the country, to revisit their agency laws, to readdress what we have. Guys, North Carolina didn't get buyer's agency until the mid-90s. That really wasn't that long ago, was it? Some of us even remember the mid-90s. It's still fairly new to this state. Today, not all states practice buyer agency. You still have states out there that don't. North Carolina does. So we were going to talk about buyer's agency. We're going to talk about seller's agency. We're going to talk about opportunities that we may be able to be both the buyer's agent and the seller's agent in the same transaction. So again, just a little bit of foresight of where we're heading with this idea, this understanding of agency. So caveat emptor. What do we say this meant? I can see mouse move. What do we say caveat emptor means? Buyer beware. North Carolina is a caveat emptor state, which means the burden of discovery, the burden of learning about the property. It's not on the seller to disclose. The burden to learn is on the buyer. When a buyer hires an agent, we take on that responsibility with them. Sellers don't have to disclose much. Brokers have to disclose everything. Right out the gate. Is that a conflict of interest between between seller and agent? We're going to talk about that conflict of interest, what that looks like, and how we can address it. Caveat emptor. Agency relationships are that of a fiduciary relationship. A fiduciary relationship is a relationship of trust. Once somebody hires me, they become my principal or my client. I'll define those words next. Once you're my principal, we are in this fiduciary relationship. In other words, once the consumer hires me and become my principal, they should trust that I have their best interest in mind. That's what the agency relationship says. You hire me, we enter into this fiduciary relationship, and I'm going to put you and your needs above all others. Sometimes that might even include my own. Understand this about agency right now. Agency isn't about you. Agency is about what's doing the best for our clients, for those that hire us. The byproduct is we get paid. Agency isn't about the broker. So let's start on 137. Let's define some words. Agency is that fiduciary relationship between the client and the firm. It's the idea that somebody represents the best interest of another. The principal or the client, used interchangeably, they both mean the same thing. The principal or the client is the one that hires us. And they do so by entering into an agency agreement with us. The agent is the one that's being hired. And as we've said, the consumer hires the firm. The firm allows me to work with their seller or their buyer. So the agent is the one that's hired. Subagent is an agent of an agent. You guys see that prefix sub? That prefix sub means under. So think like submarine, for example. We're going to spend some time on subagency. Right now, let's just understand that a subagent is an agent of an agent under an agent. The customer or the third party is the one in the transaction that didn't hire me. They didn't enter into an agency agreement with me. Bless you. They didn't form that agency relationship. I can take my entire market and I can put all consumers in two buckets. Either you're my client or you're my customer. Either you hire me or you didn't. We're going to look more about that in just a second. Agent is the firm. Once the consumer hires the firm, they are now our client. And then we have this facilitator broker, also known as a transactional broker. With these types of relationships, neither party hires the firm. Both parties are unrepresented. In North Carolina, these types of relationships are not allowed, and I will talk more about that. So facilitator, transactional broker, you're not there for the best interest of the people. You're there for the best interest of the transaction. And in North Carolina, if the broker is involved in the transaction, somebody has to hire me. We cannot work with two unrepresented parties. The agent is the firm, the broker is the individual. So let's talk more about this idea of client versus customer. The client, also known as the principal, please write that down. They're used interchangeably in our discussion. They're used interchangeably on your exams. I'm saying one and the same. The client is represented. The customer is unrepresented by the firm. Just because I don't represent you doesn't mean somebody else doesn't. But what we care about is the firm. When we talk about being represented or unrepresented, I think the best way to envision this is if we ever have to go stand in front of a judge. If you ever have to go stand in front of a judge and you're represented, you have hired an attorney and that attorney is standing next to you. If you stand in front of the judge unrepresented, you're going it alone. Now let's bring this into real estate. Those that are represented mean they have a firm, they have a broker standing with them side by side, guiding them through the transaction. To go unrepresented means you didn't hire a firm and you chose to go it alone. Nobody is required to hire an agent. People buy and sell houses all day, every day, without the assistance of a real estate agent. It kind of becomes our job to prove our worth, to encourage them to hire us, because they don't have to. There's no law that says you have to hire somebody to buy or sell a house. Isn't that something? But if they choose to, agency defines these duties that I owe them. They define, why are you hiring me? And that's what agency helps them better understand. So the client is represented by the firm. The customer is unrepresented by this firm. They may be represented by another firm, but it's through my eyes. If you didn't hire me, you are a customer. The agent works for the client. They work with the customer. In just a second, we're going to start breaking down the duties that I owe both. If you hire me, there's a certain set of duties that I owe you. If you don't hire me, there's a certain set of duties that I owe you. So we work for our client hand in hand. We work with our customer side by side. We all have a duty to get through this transaction. The agent is the firm. The agency is the relationship. I have a picture of an airplane here because when my mentor, or one of my mentors, talks about agency, she uses the analogy of an airplane. And she knows I borrowed it. Let's say you, the broker, you, the firm, are flying this plane. You're the pilot. The question is, who do I put where in my plane? If I'm flying this plane, I'm going to put my clients in first class. I'm going to put my customers back in coach. Don't I have a duty to get this plane from point A to point B? And everybody on the plane, I have a duty to get us all to, in real estate verbiage, the closing table, the end of the transaction. But my job is to get this plane and everybody on the plane from here to there. The only difference in client or customer, it's not that I'm going to get you there. The difference is the level of service I give you in between. I've heard first class is really nice. I hear you get like a warm towel and champagne and maybe a nice meal. I know for a fact what we get back in coach is like what? Unsalted pretzels and a lukewarm Coca-Cola. Right? You don't get that same level of service. And that's what we're saying with agency. The clients get a different level of service. They get more from us because they hired us. I still have duties to the customer, though. I still have the duty to get them to the finish line. It's just a level of service that we receive in between. Again, more about that in just a bit. So let's break this down specifically. Client versus customer and your role, our role for each. So if you represent the seller and the buyer is your customer, what we're saying is we're going to put the seller in first class. We're going to put the buyer back in coach. Maybe the buyer has hired another firm. I don't care. I need you to look through the eyes of your firm. When in doubt, who do I represent in this transaction? Always look towards the firm. If you represent the buyer in this transaction, that means your customer is the seller. So the buyer's now in first class, the seller's back in coach. Maybe the seller hired another firm. Maybe they're going for sale by owner. Maybe they're going it alone. Again, what we're defining here is me and my firm's duties to buyer and seller. You could have an opportunity to represent both. So both are your clients. You don't have a customer. Everybody is in first class. Does that sound tricky? It is. That's something called dual agency, and we will get to that next week, I promise. Questions coming in. How do we work with customers if they don't hire us? What do we need our help if they're selling by themselves? Great questions. We're getting ready to break down those duties. Maybe they don't want to offer to pay me compensation, so they go it alone. Again, for me to be involved, somebody has to hire a broker. And that's what this second one here is. If you don't represent either party, then both parties are back in coach. I don't owe them nothing. That's that transactional brokerage relationship that we were talking about. In order for me to be involved in a transaction, for me to provide assistance, for me to get compensation, somebody's got to hire me. You cannot have two unrepresented parties in the same transaction. So an example of that would be the for sale by owner and the unrepresented buyer. I cannot be involved in that transaction. Somebody's got to hire me. And I think that comes up because other states allow it. And I think it comes up. I had a teammate call me last year. He said, Julie, my buddy wants to buy this for sale by owner. Can I help in the transaction? I said, your buddy needs to hire you, because if your buddy doesn't hire you, you don't have a place to put people. You don't have a plane. You don't have a place to put people in your plane. So somebody's got to hire us. Again, this last one, if you represent both, that's dual agency. If you represent neither, that might be that transactional broker. More on that. I know there's a lot of questions. I get it and I hear you, and I ask that you guys please be patient because there's a really good chance that we'll cover it. So stick with me. Do I have any questions on what we've talked about so far? Basically, that client versus customer. So we're going to go ahead and take our break. I know I'm a few minutes early, but I'm at a decent stopping place. So let's go ahead and take our break. When we come back, we're going to break down the duties that I owe my clients and the duties that I owe my customers. So let's take 10. I'm going to take attendance. We've introduced you to the idea of this client versus customer. Now we're going to break down what duties I owe both. We're going to spend most of our time, I owe most of my duties to the client because they're the one that hired me. But that doesn't mean I don't owe the customer anything whatsoever. So first, let's talk about this client. Once you hire me, what do you get from me? You get old car. You get obedience, you get loyalty, disclosure, confidentiality, accounting, and reasonable skill, care, and diligence. Don't worry, we are breaking each and every single one of these down. So we have a full understanding of these duties. OCAR just helps us remember what these duties are. As I said earlier, you guys, agency is not about you. It's not about the transaction. It's about the client. Given that they don't have to hire me, don't I need to offer them something? Otherwise, why are they hiring me? I don't know, right? So what do I owe you? Once we enter into that agency agreement, I owe you OCAR as defined by that law of agency, contract law, back in the New England days when we served the king, and license law and commission rule. So let's take these duties and break each one down. The O is obedience. I have to act, the agent and the broker have to act in good faith at all times. We have to follow our principles, lawful instructions. That's so important. Make sure you get that word lawful. Nobody can make me violate license law and commission rule. Nobody can make me violate or break police rules, laws. However, if it's in the confines of the license law and commission rule, if it's in the confines of the police rule, I got to follow their instructions. They are the boss. Remember, who's making this decision? It's not me. It's them. I'm going to follow their lawful instructions. As we get further into Unit 7, we're going to have some examples of some instructions I can't follow because it would be a direct violation of license law and commission rule. It's not their job to know my job. It's my job to know my job. And that's what we're defining in Unit 7. We're defining, not only defining your lane, which we have been doing, but now we're going to start giving you a speed limit. We're going to start giving you parameters in which you can act. And following those lawful instructions are your speed limit with following within the lane. So O is I'm obedient. L says I'm loyal. I'm going to place my client's interest above all others. Sometimes that means my own. I need to be sensitive to conflicts of interest, things that aren't in their best interest. A great example of a conflict of interest, and again, we got more to say about this stuff, but a great example of a conflict of interest. That's exactly what it is. If I own a property, my name is on the deed, one of the names on the deed, I can wear two hats because I'm licensed. I could act as the seller and the listing agent. I can list property that I own. Makes sense, right? What I can't do is represent the buyer in that transaction. That would be a conflict of interest. Because if that buyer hires me, I owe them OCAR. That's the simplest breakdown. You hire me, you get OCAR. Which means OCAR says, I have your best interest in mind. I have your best interest above all others. But let's be very honest. If my name's on the deed, whose best interest do I actually have? Mine, all day long. Do we see the conflict of interest? Do we see how the buyer could feel that I'm not giving them that full first-class service? So that's an example of a conflict of interest. Again, more on that. A conflict of interest that we need to need to address. Somebody said in the chat, and I think it's right on. The loyalty piece of it says we're like that old loyal dog. You guys know your dogs and you come home, they're so happy to see you and they'll go where you go and they'll do whatever you want them to, right? Now, I'm not saying you need to wag your tail and follow your clients around, but we get the image. We do what they say. And we put their best interest above all others. The D in old car is disclose. Disclose, disclose, disclose. Know this. Real estate brokers don't have many secrets, if any. Once we learn something, we have this duty to disclose. This introduces us more to our material facts. I doubt we'll get to that today. We might touch on it today, but we can expect the big material facts discussion first thing Tuesday morning. Disclosure says I have this duty to keep my principal informed at all times. I have no secrets, you guys. Once you hire me, that's part of what you get from me. No more secrets. I have to disclose what I know. May that be disclosure about the property. May that be disclosure about the other party. Doesn't matter. I'm standing in place of my principal. What you tell me is just as good as telling them. You might as well be talking directly to them. And that's what we mean about the disclosure. I'm not going to keep secrets from my principal on anything related to this transaction. Let's take this duty of disclosure and break it down even further, specifically when we're working with sellers, specifically when we're working with buyers, to help us better understand this. So when it comes to disclosure, what do I have to disclose to my sellers? I have a duty to disclose all offers. There's a commission rule that says we have to present all offers. But Julie, what if it's a lowball offer that's just going to make my seller mad? Are you telling me I have to present it to them? Yes. What if it's an offer to do a 5-year lease to own? Are you telling me I have to present it to them? Yes. Who's making the decision on who to sell their house to? The seller. And I've got to provide all, please note that word. I present all offers. I cannot make decisions for them. I only speak on their behalf. As a seller's agent, if I find out the purchaser can go higher than they offered, maybe it is a lowball offer, but they included a pre-approval letter that tells me that the lender will allow them to borrow more. I have to disclose that to my seller. So if the buyer can pay more, does that mean they're willing to? I don't know. Could this affect our counter offer? Absolutely. But if I know the buyer can pay more than what they're offering, I have to disclose that to my seller. What are we going to do with that? Well, we need to talk about that. Each transaction, each situation is different. If I find out that the buyer is buying with the intention of turning around and selling it for a profit, I got to disclose that to my seller. Let's say, for example, there is a proposed zoning amendment on the table. And if that zoning amendment passes, it could increase the values of that area. We don't know this for some reason. We should, but we don't know this. The buyer makes an offer and he says, man, I hope this zoning amendment passes. What do you mean? Zoning amendment? What are you talking about? It could increase the value. Their intention is to buy it, wait for that zoning amendment to pass, and turn around and sell it for a profit. Doesn't my seller deserve to know that? I think with sellers, it comes down to date and time, or how much and time, money and time. That's what it is. Money and time. Some sellers have to sell right now. Some sellers can wait and see what happens to that zoning amendment. My job is to let them know. My job is to provide that information for them to make that informed decision. Then if we break this down, disclosure specifically when we're working with buyers. Once we know about some kind of deficiency, some kind of problem, some kind of issue, I have no secrets. These are our material facts that we have to disclose. Maybe the buyer has a home inspection. Maybe maybe the seller shares something with me. Maybe the listing agent shares something with me. Maybe the neighbor talks. Now, I'm not going to always take the neighbor at their word, but didn't my little red flag go up, encouraging me to investigate, to learn more about it? And then disclosure to my buyer, anything that could affect the property's value or desirability. What if that proposed zoning amendment isn't going to increase the value? It's going to decrease the value. What if DOT has plans to widen the road in front of the house? Don't our buyers have a right to know that? So again, we're helping them do this research. We're helping them learn. Buyers don't know all the places to go to learn about properties. That's something we bring to the table. That's value we bring to the table that can help them decide on that decision. We have something available to us in the multiple listing services, which we'll talk about the MLS in Unit 8. But we have in the multiple listing services, it tells us days on market. How many days has this property been on the market? And all markets are different. I think at the beginning of class, didn't I say some properties were going under contract in like 12 hours a couple years ago? Now today, the time's a little bit longer. Our days on market is longer. I just looked not too long ago, and I think the average days on market today is like 24, 25 days, something like that. So we're better than what we were, not as strong of a market as we were, but it's still a pretty swift market. It's still a fast moving market. If the average days on market is 25 days, and my buyer becomes interested in a property that's been on the market for 6 months, might there be something wrong with that property? Might that be a property I could get my buyer in at a lower price? Because everybody else is selling in less than a month, but this one's been around for 6. What's up with that property? Let's help the buyer figure that out, and it very well might affect what they offer. So again, knowing your market, being familiar with the product, being familiar with the area, absolutely can help your buyer and your seller. And it's duties that we owe them to be familiar. Questions on old: obedience, loyalty, disclose, disclose, disclose. No secrets. So let's talk about car. The C in car is confidentiality. Once you hire me, that fiduciary says that you should trust that what you tell me stays between us. Old car says I can't disclose certain information about my principal without their written permission. Remind me what we document. I can see Mal's move. What do we document? Everything. And if your seller says it's okay to tell potential buyers this, I need you to get that in writing. Get an email. I need you to get that in writing. Here's a great example. Sometimes you might see properties listed for sale. You're out in Zillow or Realtor.com playing around, and you might see a property listed for sale that says motivated seller. Aren't all sellers motivated? I mean, they put a for sale sign in their front yard, so they're motivated to sell. But what does that say about the sellers that advertise that they're motivated? Basically, what they're saying is, we would consider an offer less than asking price. We would consider anything, bring it to us. Aren't we putting some of their information out there? Isn't that something that could affect their negotiating power? That's the kind of thing that we need their written permission for. So anything that can affect that decision. When it comes to confidentiality, it's pretty simple. We tell our client everything about the customer. I tell my customer nothing about my client unless I have their written permission. Again, if you're never sure, always look to the firm. If the firm has a relationship with this person and you're talking to a customer, keep your mouth shut unless you have that written permission. We tell our client everything about the customer. I tell the customer nothing. I think this is the best first class coach example that we have. It's a different level of service, right? Once you hire me, I have no secrets. If you don't hire me, I don't know you anything. The A in OCAR is accounting. I'm going to account for my principal's funds. As we go further, we're going to get to the place in Unit 21, for example, where we will learn how to figure out how much your seller is going to get when they sell their house, when they pay off all those lien holders and they pay your commission and they pay everything off, whatever's left is for them. That's this accounting piece. Their money, I'm going to treat it like my own. I'm going to be that protective of their money. The other piece of the accounting says that I got to maintain accurate records. There's another commission rule that says we keep all records for 3 years. What do we document? Everything. How long do I keep it? For 3 years. Minimum. Can you keep it for longer? Sure. Minimum of 3 years. From the conclusion of the transaction. So if we go to closing today, that deed changes hands today. My 3-year clock starts today. Most firms out there have electronic forms, electronic documents. So there's dotloop, DocuSign, SkySlope. Maybe you've heard of some of them. Your firm is 2024. So there's a really good chance your firm has an e-management program. My firm uses dotloop. Dotloop automatically keeps everything for 10 years. So we are well within compliance. That's the beauty of cloud storage, right? You can keep, I don't know what we're going to do when the cloud runs out. I guess you and I probably don't have to worry about that in our lifetime. But, for right now, we can throw it up in the cloud, keep everything for at least 3 years, document everything, and keep it for 3 years. And then the other piece of this, back to the people's monies, there might be a point in the transaction that you have somebody else's money in your possession for the purpose of delivery. I'm going to deliver it from point A to point B. More on that when we get into contract. But the A and OCAR says when I have somebody else's money in my possession, I am fully responsible for it. My suggestion to you is get it to where it needs to go. And then the R is our reasonable skill, care, and diligence. Again, we're going to spend some time on the R. I think the R is the one that tends to get forgotten the most. Reasonable skill, care, and diligence. Reasonable skill, care, and diligence says, just because I can doesn't always mean that I should. We got to act within that reasonable skill, care, and diligence. We got to act within the parameters of license law and commission rule. Let me ask you guys something, and you can be honest with me. I'm not a cop. If you get on the interstate after class and the speed limit says 70, how fast are you going? Nobody wants to. Remember, I'm recording too. So before you, no, I'm just kidding. Isn't it really easy to go over 70? I mean, all you got to do is press that gas pedal a little bit harder. Next thing you know, you're going 75, maybe 80, right? It's pretty easy, right? What happens if you get pulled over? But officer, my car is perfectly capable of going more than 70. What's the officer going to say? Aw, here's your ticket. Just because you can speed doesn't mean that you should. Unit 7 and 8 are teaching you the speed limit. It's really easy to speed, super easy. It's not going to protect you from violating license law and commission rule. Let me ask you guys something else. Do you get caught every time you go over 70? Do you get caught sometimes you're going over 70? So if you do speed, there's no guarantee you'll get pulled over. It's not a problem until it's a problem. And now we have a problem. Reasonable skill, care, and diligence. Let's break this down further for sellers and buyers. When we're working with sellers, at some point in your listing appointment, the seller's going to look at you and say, how much should I list my house for? It's really easy just to blurt a number out there, right? But reasonable skill, care, and diligence says, I got to answer that professionally. I got to do some research. I got to look at the market. I got to look at the values of that neighborhood. I have to pull what's referred to as comps or comparables. We'll talk about that in Unit 17. When I'm answering the question, how much should we list it for? I'm providing a reasonable answer. What do I, in my professional opinion, feel that we can sell your house for? Also, with sellers, anything about the buyer that would affect the seller's decision. For example, we already said, if we know the buyer's pre-approval letter is more than what they're offering, reasonable skill, care, and diligence says, I need to share that with my seller. Now, I have no guarantee that the buyer will pay more than what they're offering. But remember, I'm providing the facts. I'm letting them know. I know this buyer offered 95. I know they're pre-approved for 125. What do y'all want to do, right? I'm letting them know. Now they have a decision to make. That decision is coming in Units 9 and 10 when we get into contracts. We're going to negotiate. We're going to make an offer. We're going to negotiate. We're going to go under contract in Units 9 and 10. Effectively advertising the property. What are you going to do to attract buyers? Well, all agents will look at sellers and say, I'll put this in the multiple listing services. Once you put it in the multiple listing services, from there it gets fed to thousands, and I'm not making that number up, thousands of websites. Anywhere you see a house for sale online, all starts from the multiple listing service. So I'm trying to, maybe it's a competitive listing appointment, which means you're competing with other brokers. The winner gets the listing. And you look at that seller and say, if you hire me, I'll put it in MLS. And then they talk to another agent. I'll put it in MLS once you hire me. What am I doing different than that other agent? News alert. We all put it in MLS. What else are you going to do? How else are you going to advertise and help them sell their property? Are you going to do print media? Are you going to send out postcards? Are you going to network? And then we're also going to help the seller translate the terms of an offer. Again, a little bit of foreshadowing. Our standard offer to purchase and contract is 17 pages. We'll meet that in Unit 10. There's a lot of information in those 17 pages. The offers are more than how much. There's a lot more involved. And if you hand a non-licensee a 17-page sales contract and say, look this over and tell me what you think, what did you do to help them? What did you do to understand what those terms mean? So when we're working with sellers, once the seller hires me, we need to, and an offer comes in, We need to sit down and go over those terms. What do these terms mean? How does this shake out for you? What if you're a listing agent in a multiple offer situation? You get more than one offer. The seller's going to look at you and say, I don't know which one to accept. So we're going to help them understand what those terms mean. We're going to help them translate the terms of that offer. So a question comes in, if you see a sign saying Keller Williams, but you don't work for them, can you still show them the client, your buyer client, I'm assuming, can you still show your buyer client the property? Absolutely. Absolutely. The multiple listing services create an inventory for everybody that's a member of that MLS. Can we agree with the statement that a salesman needs a product to sell? Without a product to sell, what kind of salesman are you, right? So if you currently don't have any listings, what you got to sell? Nothing. So part of what we do in the MLS, again, more on that coming in Unit 8, but part of what we do in MLS is pull our listings together to create inventory. So I can show listings that my firm has listed. I can show listings that other firms have listed, thanks to our multiple listing services. So reasonable skill, care, and diligence. Guys, these multiple offers, seriously, a couple years ago with this crazy seller's market, one of the brokers in my firm took a listing, and we knew, because we knew the market and it's crazy seller's market, multiple offers. So we knew it was going to go, what it was going to happen. I don't remember how many showings they had that weekend. I think they listed it like Thursday or Friday. And then they called for all finals in by like Sunday. So they only had it, 2 or 3 days. And I don't remember how many showings they had, but they got 42 offers. That's the kind of market we're coming out of. What's 42 times 17 pages? Could you imagine that's like a ream of paper, isn't it? Could you imagine handing your seller a ream of paper saying, look this over and let me know which one you wanna choose? And the seller's going, why did I hire this person? Help them sort through those multiple offers. Help them decide which one is the best for them. The only way I know to help them translate the terms of the offer is for us, the licensee, the professional, to be familiar with the sales contract, to know what it says, to know what it means. And again, we're introducing you to that in Unit 10. Reasonable skill, care, and diligence owed to the buyer. Flip this coin. You're out showing property. Buyer walks in the front door and says, this is it. This is my dream home. Let's write it up. And then the next question out of their mouth is going to be, how much should I offer? Again, reasonable skill, care, and diligence says I just can't blurt a number out there. I got to have a professional response. Once again, I'm pulling numbers. I'm looking at comparables. I'm studying the market. Don't look at your buyer and say, oh, just offer asking price. I'm sure the seller priced it right. No, that's not practicing reasonable skill, care, and diligence. We got to do some research. We got to help our buyers determine what is a fair and reasonable offer price. And again, a lot of that comes down to the market. Remember our pendulum, that market's on a pendulum. And a couple of years ago, when we got 40 some offers, we were in a seller's market that was like way up here. Seller's market's adjusting. We're probably more like here now, come down a little bit, still a strong seller's market. But one day in the near future, I don't know when, but one day that pendulum's coming back around and we're going to be in a buyer's market. Who's driving in a buyer's market? Now the buyers are in control, aren't they? So how much should I offer? A lot of that may depend on if we're in a competitive market right now. Are we in a buyer's market or a seller's market? So again, I say we have to be the experts of our market. We have to know what's going on so we can advise. Reasonable skill, care, and diligence to the buyer. I'm going to help them locate and see suitable properties. You have professional buyers out there. I call them professional tire kickers. They're not interested in buying. They just want to go out and look at pretty homes. And they may need an agent to do that to get them in the front door. Helping to qualify those buyers with financing. I'll talk about that in a second. But helping to qualify those buyers, helping to show them suitable properties. I'm not going to show you everything on the market. I'm going to show you the properties that check off your boxes. I'm going to show you the properties that you can afford. That's going to save both of us time, right? When you come across the professional tire kickers, tell them to go open housing this weekend. That's where they can get in and see pretty houses. But this is back to our suitable properties. What can they afford? What is on their needs and wants list? Seriously, hand them a piece of paper. Draw a line down the middle. On one side is your needs, on one side is your wants. If you're married, if you're dealing with married couple or a couple purchasing a home, give each of them a piece of paper. I swear sometimes I have talked to a couple and I have wondered how I'm going to get them both under the same roof. Because she's talking about she needs this and he needs that. And I'm like, my goodness, their needs and wants lists are way off. Help get them together. I got to get them under the same roof. Does that make sense? Suitable properties, and save yourself some time and energy and gas and only show them properties that check off their boxes. We also need to make sure that they're qualified. Everybody wants to buy a house. Everybody wants to buy a house. The question is, who can afford to buy a house? And that's where the financing comes in. The majority of us need a lender. The majority of us require financing. Before you start showing buyers properties, have them talk to this lender and get pre-approved. Have them talk to a lender to give us a parameter. So we know the properties that we're showing, they can afford. Financing, again, that's all coming in units 14 and 15. We're still a couple weeks out. And then also with the buyers, we're going to help them. I'm going to present an offer on their behalf. I'm going to talk to my buyer about what they want to offer. Again, where do these conversations come from? Come from the market, knowing the market. It comes from doing our comps. It comes from advising them on what we believe would be acceptable today. Once we come up with the terms, then I'm going to present the offer on behalf of my buyer. And I'm going to present it by submitting it to the listing agent or the seller if they're going for sale by owner. And I'm going to present it like it's the best daggum offer that's ever been. Maybe it's a great offer, maybe it's not. But you know what? It's your buyer's offer. And as their agent, doesn't Old Car say, I'm going to treat you better than all others. As a listing agent, I have had buyer's agents call me and say, I'm sending you an offer. I mean, it's not great. I'm sure you'll get better, but it's what my guys are willing to do. So just consider it and let us know as soon as you can. Is that how you Old Car? Is that how you best represent your buyer? I hope not. Reasonable skill, care, and diligence for both. What have we been saying? We need to stay current on the market. We need to be experts of the market. Houses come and go. Buyers and sellers come and go. You know what remains? The market. Studying the market, knowing what's going on in the market is one of the best things that we can offer our buyers and sellers. Being familiar with zoning changes, NCDOT road proposals. Again, lots of research we're helping our buyers and sellers do. They may not know to check out zoning and NCDOT. That's part of the value that I bring to the table. So staying current, being the experts of the market in which you choose to work. So reasonable skill, care, and diligence. Gee, Julie, what's the big deal? Well, failure to speed, or if you're speeding, failure to stay within the speed limit means you could be found guilty of negligence or misconduct Those that don't practice reasonable skill, care, and diligence may be harming the public. And remember what our number one purpose is to protect them. So failure to perform this reasonable skill, care, and diligence could absolutely be seen as misconduct. The broker and or the firm could be liable to the principal for any damages. We may forfeit our commission. And any violation of license law and commission rule could result in disciplinary action by the North Carolina Real Estate Commission. Put real estate aside for a second. Pretend real estate doesn't exist for 1 second. Anybody can sue, and you can sue anybody for anything. Let me say that again. You can sue anybody for anything. Could the buyer or the seller sue you or the firm after the transaction if they don't feel that they had that reasonable skill, care, and diligence, that old car, the information? Could they take you to court? Sure. Are you going to win? I don't know. I don't know that. What I do know is you got a better leg to stand on if you go into a court of law with your documentation. If you go in there with no documentation, you might as well not go. Everybody with me? The Real Estate Commission can't fine you. They can't require you to reimburse anybody. They can't require you to forfeit your compensation. Any matters dealing with money is coming from the courts. So what I'm telling you guys is there's a couple different things that could happen. You could face disciplinary action on your license from the Real Estate Commission and or be sued, be fined in a court of law. It really comes down to the buyer or seller. How badly did you harm them? And if they got a good enough attorney. We're in a pretty litigious society these days, aren't we? Everybody's suing everybody at the drop of a hat. Does that mean we're immune? Absolutely not. Think about these price tags on houses. And if you harm somebody, if you cost them money due to your misconduct, absolutely they can take you to court. Absolutely they can report you to the North Carolina Real Estate Commission. So how do we stay out of court? How do we stay out of disciplinary action? This is why you guys are here. License, law, and commission rule. This is why you have to take this class. It's a lot to take in, isn't it? That's why we're here. So with reasonable skill, care, and diligence, let's look at an example together. Let's talk about Colin. Colin is a buyer's agent. He gets a request from his buyer to see a property still in North Carolina that is 200 miles outside of his geographical area that he normally provides services. The question is, can Colin show his buyer that property? Again, it's located in North Carolina. So can Colin hop in the car, drive 200 miles and show that property? Can he? Sure. The follow-up question is, should he? And that's a question you and I can't answer for Colin. Because here's the deal. If Colin is willing to learn about that market 200 miles away, and Colin is willing to go to that market every time the buyer wants to see that property, or they want an inspection, or they need to talk to whatever. If he's willing to do the work, as long as the property is located in the state of North Carolina, go for it, Colin. But if Colin is not willing to learn that market, if Colin is not willing to familiarize himself with that area, and more importantly, make the drive, then Colin's best bet would be to refer it to an agent in that area that knows the market and let them handle the transaction. A referral fee is better than nothing at all. A referral fee is better than disciplinary action. So can he? Absolutely. Should he? That's up to Colin. And that's again where we need to decide the parameters that we want to work. We need to decide our boundaries. How far are you willing to go? Some of you may be okay with working the entire triad. Others of you may not want to leave Forsyth County. My license says I can help with any property in the state of North Carolina. It's up to me to set my parameters. Does this make sense? So if I have a buyer in Winston, and all of a sudden, I'm not going to Greensboro. I hate Greensboro, and it's too far away. I don't want to make the drive. And all of a sudden, that buyer says, wow, something came on the market in Greensboro. Can we go see it? You now have a decision to make. If you're not willing to drive the whole way to Greensboro, then you need to refer them. If Greensboro to you is a hop, skip, and a jump away, let's go. Does this make sense? Just because you can. And part of that reasonable skill, care, and diligence is you need to decide your parameters. You need to decide how far you are willing to go. I've had agents in Lexington cry about driving to Winston-Salem. If you're familiar with the area, you know that's not that far of a drive. But hey, if that's not your market, then just stay in Lexington. Everybody with me? That's your decision to make. OCAR is what I owe to my principal. Again, back to the original question. If I hire you, what do I get? You get OCAR: obedience, loyalty, disclosure, confidentiality, accounting, and reasonable skill, care, and diligence. What questions or comments do I have about OCAR? So if OCAR is what the people in first class get, what about everybody else back in coach? What do the customers get? Remember, I only got two choices. You're either my client or you're my customer. You either get first class or you get coach. You get first class treatment because you hire me using an agency agreement. If we don't have an agency agreement, then you are a customer. Does that mean I'm going to leave you high and dry and let you figure this out all on your own? You're back in coach. Remember, my job is to get you from point A to point B. And there are duties that I owe those back in coach. So what do you get from me in coach? You get honesty. I'm never allowed to lie. Nobody ever has a golden ticket to lie. You get fairness. I'm going to treat everybody the same. And you also get disclosure of material facts. Everybody, client and customer, gets disclosure. Remember earlier when I said disclose, disclose, disclose? We always have a duty to disclose material facts. I do not care who you're talking to. Are you talking to a client? Are you talking to a customer? We always have a duty to disclose material facts. If I may word that another way, we never have a reason not to disclose material facts. If you haven't written this down yet, do so. Disclose, disclose, disclose. When in doubt, disclose. So let's say I am the listing agent, which means the seller has hired me, which means the seller's my client. And a buyer becomes interested in my listing. Maybe that buyer has been hired by another firm. Maybe that buyer is unrepresented. And the seller shares a material fact with me. Julie, every time it rains hard, the basement floods. If you were buying this house, would you consider that material? Would you consider that important? You got to deal with a flooded basement every time it rains. So the seller looks at me and says, the basement floods whenever it rains hard. Shh. Don't tell anybody. What's disclosure material facts say? I have to tell that buyer customer. That's part of those lawful instructions that I can't follow. The seller doesn't have to disclose. They can hide behind material fact. I'm sorry, they can hide behind caveat emptor. Let me say that again, please. The seller doesn't have to disclose. They can hide behind caveat emptor. Us as licensees, we have to disclose everything. Conflict of interest between me and my seller? Better believe it. Stay tuned for more on that next week when we get into material facts. So we have these conversations up front. You tell the seller before you view their home, I have this duty to disclose. And even when they look at you and say, shh, don't tell anybody, that's an unlawful instruction that I cannot follow. We always have a duty to disclose material facts. Question, do you have to tell them straight out or only if asked? I have to disclose. I'm not good. This isn't a don't ask, don't tell kind of thing. Once I know of a material fact, I always have to disclose. Part of this big duty with our customers, this honesty and fairness thing, a lot of this comes down to our advertising. We need to make sure that we're properly advertising a product or a property. Remember how the internet works, right? You put a listing in and it's submitted and it goes to the world. Everybody in the world can see your listing. So you are advertising this property to everybody. We need to make sure that our listings are accurate. We need to make sure that we're not lying. That's not treating the customers honestly. So what we put in our listings, what we put in our advertising needs to be accurate. Now, when it comes to advertising, there's something out there called puffing. Puffing is an exaggerated opinion. It's not a lie. It's close. It's awfully close, but it's an exaggerated opinion. Puffing is okay as long as it's not misrepresenting the property. We like to use puffing. We like to use, if you guys have ever seen the description of a property, we like to use a lot of fancy adjectives to help paint a picture of the property, help make it desirable, help make it attractive. There's a difference in puffing would be like best house on the block. Well, that's probably my opinion. Your opinion may have that another house on the block is better, right? If you were selling, let's see. If you were selling or listing, we're down at the coast here in this picture. So let's say you're getting ready to list this property. And right across from this property is a vacant piece of land that faces the ocean. The difference in this advertising, I would not advertise this as ocean view. Because what happens when somebody shows up, buys this land and builds on it? What did you do to their ocean view? Everybody with me? I would advertise this as a front row property or across the street from the ocean. You see what I'm saying? We need to be careful in what we say. It'd be so easy to be like, you can walk out on your front porch and look at the ocean. And that's all fine and dandy until that guy starts building. And that's the kind of thing that we need to be aware, make sure in our advertising that we're not misrepresenting. If we are, we're just maybe exaggerating, putting your opinion in there, trying to paint a pretty picture. So see, I got in the chat. Would it be ethical if when we represented a seller, we say before filling out the paperwork, don't tell me anything about the property, you don't want anyone else to know? That's exactly what we need to tell them. We need to let them know, you don't have to disclose anything. I have to disclose everything. Be careful what you tell me. And if they don't tell you, what would be unethical is if I didn't tell the seller that. Could you imagine going on a listing appointment and you're following a seller and you're writing down all the problems? Oh, yep, that's broken. There's a leak and that's fixed. And then at the end you say, I'm required to share that to all potential buyers. How did you just make your seller feel? Betrayed, like you got one over on them? So we have these duties up front to have these conversations up front. There you go. To have these conversations up front. Again, you guys, it's not their job to know my job. It's my job to know my job. And it's my job to explain, be upfront, tell them what's getting ready to happen. We're the professionals in the situation, and we need to act as such. We need to act accordingly. Good questions. We're going to talk again when we get into material facts next week. I hate to leave you guys hanging, but when we get into material facts next week, we're going to address more about how we can have these conversations with sellers and buyers to keep it fair for everybody. And I'm telling you right now, how do you keep it fair for everybody? You set those expectations early on. You don't catch them off guard. You don't surprise them. You have these conversations early on. But you guys set your chats to private. I got a question for you. So set your chats to private. And in a private chat, tell me A, B, C, or D. Anybody in? So this idea of a fiduciary. Who am I in this fiduciary relationship with? It's the one that hires me. It's my client. It's my principal. It's that relationship of trust. That client should trust that I have their best interest in mind. So when it comes to fiduciary, that relationship with the client or the principal, those are the duties that I owe them of OLCAR. Am I going to get paid? Yes, because we're using an agency agreement. And an agency agreement is an employment contract. Would you guys ever go on a job interview and not talk about how much you're going to get paid if you get the job? Would you ever? I hope not. Same thing with going on a listing appointment or a buyer consultation. We need the discussions about how am I going to get paid when I do the job that you've hired me to do. That's covered in our agency agreements coming in Unit 8. Somebody came in the chat. I love it. It said, went back to our puffing. I don't know if I can find it. I think somebody said cozy equals small. Yeah, it's like investor's delight. Have you guys seen that? Investor's delight means that there's probably a lot of work that needs to be done, right? I mean, we get very a diamond in the rough. I've heard that one as well. You know, we get very creative. Again, just make sure that your puffing doesn't cross the line of misrepresentation. A misrepresentation is a lie, plain and simple. So make sure your puffing is your exaggerated opinion. Cozy is a lot better word than small, right? Investor's delight is a much better word for fixer upper, right? Those kind of things. We need to properly advertise a property. We can never misrepresent the property. Maybe that's why we have a lot of pictures and video too, so we don't have to use as many fancy adjectives. Chat GPT. Agents are starting to use that for their remarks. And you can tell when you read the remarks, especially when you know the agent. You're like, I know darn well they don't talk like that. You can tell, but be careful. If y'all want Chat GPT to write your remarks, that's fine. Review it before you put it out. That thing, AI technology, it's not perfect. The human still had to create it, right? So you can use it if you're not the wordsman. I get it. Use it to help describe the property, but you still have a duty to review it to make sure that it's accurate. Does that make sense? When you put a listing out under your name, you are the listing agent who is liable for the information you're putting out. You. What questions do I have? comments so far? We are at a perfect stopping place and we're close enough to time. So I'm going to go and call it. Don't go anywhere just yet. When we come together on Tuesday next week, we're going to start Unit 7, page 142 on material facts. And then we're basically next week, like I said, we're going to be in Unit 7. Does this speak to you guys? We spent 4 classes going through 7 units. Now we're going to spend at least 2.5 going through 1. What's this tell you about Unit 7 without me telling you anything about Unit 7, right? Take the time to look ahead. Take the time to review what we're going to talk about next week. And don't forget, you guys, you will still be tested on units 1 through 6 and 20. So while we go on, while we continue in agency, don't forget to incorporate review time, because when we get to your exam in May, Joint Tennessee is going to seem like it was forever ago. So don't spend all your time reviewing, but remember to go back and review what we've already covered as we continue to go and move forward. Does that make sense? Please, please find us some study time. It's getting deep, and next week is going to be all about agency. Guys, remember, I'm available all weekend. If there's anything I can do, any questions I can answer, anything I can do to help, I'm here. Just reach out. Otherwise, I hope y'all have a great weekend. Promise me you'll go do something fun this weekend. Everybody pinky swear me. Julie, I'm going to go find something fun to do. Make time for fun. Okay. Y'all have a great weekend. We'll see you Tuesday morning. That's right. It's a holiday weekend, isn't it? Yes, that's right. I forgot.